Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching. Crystal Ballroom of Solfege Prime had been built to impress, but Edmund Russell had no attention to spare for vaulted ceilings or holographic banners, or the light of 3 stars breaking across 34 species dressed in their finest. He stood near the 3rd pillar from the eastern entrance and looked at the room. 4 days ago Tharvex had shown him the transmission, the being who had held the galaxy together for 15 years. Without open war, the 134 species had gathered here to celebrate Lord Peace. They called him half title, half expectation. The message had appeared on his private channel. No clearance request, no warning. It had simply been there. Figure of metal and shadow filled the projection, voice stripped of anything resembling warmth. Join us willingly or be broken. Your precious peace ends today. Tharvex had let it play once straight through, then stood behind his desk with his long fingers pressed flat against its surface, holding himself in that controlled stillness. Russell knew too well. There had been no hesitation. No, that had been the entire reply. Russell had not doubted that for a second. What he doubted, what still refused to settle into anything that made sense, was the channel it had come through. Quantum encrypted, personal, accessible to fewer beings in the galaxy than Russell had fingers on one hand. Around him, recycled air carried alien perfume and diplomatic caution in equal measure. The banners rippled, the stars burned overhead in fractured light. The ballroom glittered with power, ceremony, and the kind of smiles that never meant safety. Russell kept watching the room. He had contacted Severus within the hour, told him to watch the ceremony feed and have assets ready. Severe had not asked why. That was why Russell trusted him. Security had been ramped up. Russell had walked the perimeter himself that morning, checked the sensor grids, the phase disruption barriers, the positioning of the council guard details. Everything looked correct. Everything looked exactly the way it should look to someone who had been told to make it look correct. Tharvex stood at the central podium now, his pale Arconian features composed, his voice carrying the particular cadence he used. For moments he considered historic. The words about coexistence and shared futures moved through the ballroom, and the assembled dignitaries received them the way they always did, with the practiced warmth of people who had been at peace long enough to forget what the alternative felt like. Russell kept watching. He did not know what he was looking for. That was the problem, and the discipline simultaneously. When you know a threat exists but not its shape or its vector or its timing, you stop looking for specific things and start looking for anything that does not belong. A sound that arrives a half-beat wrong. A body that stops moving when the bodies around it are still moving. A gap in the room's natural texture that should not be a gap. He moved his attention across the exits, the northern doors, the southern service access, the gallery above, 3 directions that a threat could use if a threat knew the room. He looked at the ceiling coverage and the gaps in it and the way the sensor grids had been positioned, and whether the positioning made sense from a security standpoint or from the standpoint of someone who needed the positioning to look like it made sense. He looked at the council security detail, their spacing there, sight aligns, the direction there Attention moved, and whether it moved. The way trained attention moves, or the way attention moves when it has been directed somewhere specific to keep it from moving somewhere else. He found nothing. That did not mean nothing was there. Tharvix said the word in unity, and the ballroom responded with a sound like approval, and Russell was still scanning, still reading the texture of the room when the lights died. Complete darkness, one beat of silence, so total it felt pressurized. Then the air cracked. Phase displacement was a sound Russell had never heard before tonight and would never forget after, like reality folding. At the seams, it came from multiple points simultaneously. The northern exit, the stage flanks the gallery above. The Voreth did not enter the ballroom. They arrived in it black and crimson, sleek and augmented, already moving with the mechanical certainty of soldiers who had run this operation in simulation until the variables disappeared. Russell was already cutting through the crowd toward the podium, moving with the controlled violence of a man who knows that running in darkness causes collisions, and collisions cause delays. He used shoulders and elbows and the gaps between panicking bodies, and he did not stop. A neural whip discharged somewhere to his left. He heard a body drop. Stage was 12M, then 8, then 4. The shot came from the gallery, 1 round clean. The sound of it was almost polite against the backdrop of screaming. Russell's gaze cut to the Arconian side of the room. Something. They're not moving, not reacting. Tharvix folded at the podium, not thrown back, not dramatic, just a sudden absence of the uprightness that had defined him. Russell crossed the last 2 meters and caught him before he hit the floor. The Chancellor's weight was wrong, already wrong. Russell went down with him, one knee on the crystal floor, Tharvix's head against his chest. The broadcast drone above the stage held its position with mechanical indifference, its lens catching everything. Tharvix looked up at him with the expression of a man who had calculated the odds of this moment and accepted them some time ago. His mouth moved. Russell lowered his head. Whatever Lord Peace said at the end, he said it only to the one person in the galaxy who had taken the threat seriously. Russell stayed there for 3 seconds. 3 was all he allowed himself. Then he pressed 2 fingers to Tharvix's neck and confirmed what he already knew and stood up. The council security team hit him from 3 sides simultaneously. They were not Voroth, they were council guard Sale Rune's people in the chain. Russell understood that with cold clarity as the restraints locked around his wrists. The accusation came fast and rehearsed: human incompetence, security failure, the representatives negligence. Someone had to be the explanation, and the explanation had been chosen before the lights died. Russell did not resist. Resistance here cost him everything and gained him nothing. He let them turn him and push him toward the corridor, and as they moved him through the chaos, he looked back once across the ballroom. Saloon stood near the western pillar, still composed, watching Russell being removed with the expression of a man watching a plan execute correctly. Russell looked at him for exactly as long as it took to confirm what he already knew. Then he faced forward and walked. The detention corridor was cold and gray and built for function. They pushed him into a holding cell and the door sealed, and Russell stood in the center of the space and breathed once slowly and began to work. His left eye moved in a way that had Nothing to do with vision. The retinal implant was a piece of hardware that had cost more favors than he cared to count, and had been embedded by a UED field surgeon in a back room on a station that did not officially exist. The scan protocols used by council security were thorough. They were not thorough enough. He began to compile station layout from memory, Vorath entry vectors from what he had observed in the ballroom, guard rotation pattern from the footsteps outside the door, force strength, estimates from the number of displacement events he had counted. During the breach, he built the picture, and he began to transmit across the station in the ruined crystal ballroom. Tech Lord Vericon materialized. His hologram filled the space from floor to vaulted ceiling, rendering him in cold blue light above the bodies and the blood and the shattered dignity of 15 years. His voice did not boom. It did not need to. It was the voice of a man explaining something to someone who no longer had a choice. The age of weak coexistence is over. The Vorath Dominion now rules this galaxy. Submit or die. The image held for a moment on Tharvix's body where it lay at the base of the podium, then the feed cut. Across the ballroom, a Vorath soldier raised one hand to the side of his helmet, a small gesture, the kind of movement that meant someone on the other end of a channel had just finished speaking. He looked at Salon, raised his weapon. Salon saw it coming in the last half second and understood that the Vorath did not make alliances, they made instruments, and instruments were discarded the moment the work was done. He did not have time to say anything. The shot snapped him backward. He fell among the dignitaries he had betrayed in the blood of the Chancellor he had killed. He had been promised a seat at a new table. He died on the floor of the old one in the detention corridor. Russell watched it on the wall monitor. As it played across every channel, he did not move. His expression never changed. He filed Vericon's vocal patterns and cadence the same way he had filed Saloon's face and kept building his transmission. At UE Orbital Command, General Marcus Sayes had been watching the feed since Russell told him to watch it. He had seen the lights die. He had seen something arrive in a room that every protocol in the galaxy said nothing could reach. He had watched Russell cut through the crowd toward the podium with the grim efficiency of a man who already knew he would not be fast enough. He had watched Tharvix fall, Lord Peace. That was what the diplomatic corps had called him for a decade, the being who had looked at centuries of war and decided, with the full force of his considerable intelligence, that it did not have to continue, who had built something fragile and real and worth protecting from nothing but will and words, and the stubborn refusal to accept that conflict was the natural state of existence. Sayes had met him twice. Both times Tharvix had treated him with the particular courtesy that brilliant people extend to soldiers, respectful, genuine, slightly puzzled, as though he understood the necessity of men like severe but could not quite map their interior landscape. He watched the Chancellor's body lying at the base of the podium. Moments later he listened as Vericon's voice filled every channel in the galaxy. The room around Sayes was silent. His staff knew what a man looked like when you did not speak to him. The feed cut to static. Sayes picked up the command channel. One order, flat and without inflection, the way he gave every order that he intended to be the last word on a subject. The fleet moved. The Vorath who came for Russell knew exactly who he was. They opened the cell door without announcement and stood inside the threshold and looked at him the way professionals look at a problem they have been given time to solve. Russell looked back. They knew his name, his rank, his tenure on the council. They knew he had been Tharks's closest confidant. They knew he had contacted UED Orbital Command before the ceremony. C had been thorough. Russell noted the questions were precise. UED Fleet disposition, Orbital Command structure, human military capability, response timelines. They were not asking randomly. They were filling gaps in intelligence they already partially held, which told Russell more about Voreth preparation than anything they said directly. He answered carefully enough to seem cooperative, enough to seem like a man calculating his survival odds and making reasonable decisions. Everything he said was either publicly available or specifically constructed to be useless in the field. Aboard his flagship, Sayes pulled up every scrap of intelligence available on the Voreth 4 days ago. Within the hour of Russell's call, he had started collecting. He had not waited to see if the threat was real. Russell did not make calls like that without reason, and Sayes had learned a long time ago that the cost of taking Russell seriously was always lower than the cost of not doing so. He had pulled every allied contact he had, called in favors from species whose sensor networks reach places human arrays did not, and tasked his analysts with everything they could find on a dominion that nobody in this galaxy had formally encountered before. What they had built in 4 days was incomplete. It was enough. What came in now from the ceremony feed and the first wave of battlefield telemetry did not complete the picture. It sharpened it. Patterns in Voreth movement, response timing that looked too synchronized to be ordinary. Command relay enough to suggest a system behind it, though not yet enough to name it with certainty. Then he waited for the next transmission. It didn't come. He watched the feed indicator for a long moment. In 15 years of working with Russell, he had learned to read the man's silences the way other people read words. A voluntary cut looked different from an interrupted one. He knew which this was. He looked at his boarding team commanders. Finding Russell was now the priority, he said at once, and the room shifted around it. In the cell, the Voreth were still questioning Russell when the scan began. Then something changed. The exchange stopped midline. Both officers went still, listening to something he could not hear. One of them left. The other stayed by the door and did not speak. Again, Russell kept his face neutral and waited. The door opened and Russell felt the change in the room, the way you feel a drop in temperature. Something large and certain, accustomed to obedience, had entered the space. Tech Lord Varicon did not announce himself. The interrogation officer left without being told to. The door stayed open. Varicon looked at Russell the way a technician looks at equipment that has been operating outside its parameters. He crossed the cell in 3 steps and crouched to Russell's eye level and studied him for a moment. Then he reached out with 2 fingers, long gray, the joints reinforced with subdermal augmentation that showed as faint ridges beneath the skin, and pressed them against Russell's left temple with the certainty of someone who had done this before and expected it to work. Russell felt the augmentation activate before he understood its purpose. A focused signal drove into the orbital cavity, precise and controlled, designed for exactly this kind of intrusion. It was not blunt force, and it did not strike like ordinary violence. It found the implant the way a key finds a lock, and once it did, it began to work. The pain that followed was not like other pain. Russell had been shot, he had been burned, he had taken damage in a dozen engagements across 2 decades of service that had left its record permanently on his body. He knew the difference between pain the mind could compartmentalize and pain the nervous system simply refused to negotiate with. He knew where his threshold was. The sound Russell made was not voluntary. It tore out of him before he could stop it. Then his body shut down. Darkness took him. He came back to sound first. Ventilation, distant footsteps, the low, steady hum of something mechanical. Beyond the door, his face felt wrong. Padded, covered, held in place by something that ran from his brow to the bridge of his nose and wrapped around to the back of his skull. He could feel the slight chemical coolness of it against what was underneath, and he did not reach up to check because he already knew no pain. That meant something had been applied. The blindfold, most likely, whatever it was doing its work with the same clinical efficiency the Voreth applied to everything else. They needed him alive. He lay still and took inventory, hands unrestrained back against the cell floor, body intact below the neck, breathing steady, though his chest moved more carefully than usual, the reflex of a nervous system still negotiating with what had been done to it. He stayed there for a long moment. The dark was not going to change. No implant, no vision, no light coming through at any angle or intensity, for now there was nothing he could do. He moved on. He put his hands flat on the floor, found the wall, and pushed himself upright. He listened to the ventilation, the footsteps in the low background, vibration beyond the door, and began to build his map. 2 guards outside. Sound around them wasn't identical. Slight asymmetry that told him one was running older hardware. Beyond them, the corridor felt different now, tighter, more deliberate in its movement. Something in the station had shifted. Reinforcements had been repositioned, or orders redistributed. Either way, the rhythm had changed. Russell straightened his back against the wall and set his hands on his thighs and waited. He had given them nothing they could use. He intended to keep it that way. The first impact came through the structure, distant, controlled, and not part of the station's normal operation. Russell tilted his head slightly and listened. Moments later, the fleet came out of faster than light in a wall. Sayes did not slow the approach. He came in hard and direct, hitting the station before the Voreth could fully stabilize their defenses. The Voreth had partially reconfigured the station's external defenses, but the system was not yet stable. Defense fire crossed in uneven patterns as they tried to bring it into alignment, and Severus hit that window before it closed. The first exchange was short and violent, and boarding craft detached in its wake. They drove in fast and low along the station hull, and the boarding teams were already preparing their charges before the Voreth could fully respond. The first doors came down, boots hit corridor floors, heavy and deliberate. The sound of people already committed to the fight. The station's lighting was partial and uneven from the Voreth reconfiguration. But the boarding teams moved through it without breaking stride. They had trained for worse, and they were not slowing down now. The Vorath had been told humans were dangerous. They were about to learn it. In close quarters, the first corridor cost them. The Vorath did not fight the way the boarding teams had trained. Against, they did not hold positions or exchange fire with the tactical logic of soldiers reading a battlefield in real time. They moved like a single organism, one unit pulling back as another closed. From the flank, pressure applied and released in precise patterns. That level of coordination suggested direct communication. Sergeant Davo Rice, a boarding team commander on the eastern approach, watched two of his people go down in a crossfire they could not possibly have seen coming. He understood what it meant. He made the decision in the time it took to drag the nearest body into cover. He pulled his remaining people back 12 m and blew the ceiling junction. The structural collapse bought them the corridor, killed 2 Vorath, and temporarily disrupted the sightlines that had been coordinating the flanking elements. It also buried the route they had come in on. There was no going back. Rice looked at his people. They looked back. Nobody said anything. The math was obvious, and the direction was forward. They moved. Other teams were pushing through the northern and western approaches. The breach spread wide enough that the Vorath could not concentrate their response without leaving gaps elsewhere. The gaps were small. The boarding teams found every one of them human. Adaptability in a corridor was not a tactical concept. It was a biological fact, the accumulated reflex of a species that had been solving the problem of how to kill things in enclosed spaces for the entirety of its existence. They picked up Vorath phase disruptors from the bodies as they went, worked out the trigger geometry by feel, and turned them on live targets. The weapons worked exactly as well in human hands as they had in Vorath ones, which was information the Vorath had apparently not considered worth accounting for. The node was in the northern hub. Every team was already moving toward it, but they Vorath knew that too and had concentrated accordingly. In the detention block, the battle was a language Russell was reading through the hull. Breach charges had a specific percussion, sharp, directional, the echo telling him distance and approximate corridor width. Human weapons had a different report than Vorath phase disruptors, the latter carrying a frequency that resonated differently against the station's metal walls. He tracked both, mapped the engagement lines by sound, and cross-referenced them against the station layout he had been carrying in his memory for 15 years. The eastern approach team was pushing hard. The northern team was close to the node but angling wrong. They were defaulting to the main corridor junction when the service passage 2 levels down would put them directly underneath the node room, with one sealed door between them and the target instead of 4. They did not know about the service passage. It was not on the standard layout schematics. Russell knew about it because he had walked this station for 15 years and because 3 years ago a maintenance issue had required him to accompany a repair crew through exactly that route. The Vorath outside his cell had thinned. He could hear it in the spacing of the footsteps. The augmentation hummed more distant than it had been. Units pulled toward the fighting. Standard defensive reallocation. Predictable. He put his back against the Wall and his feet flat on the floor, and waited for the sound that would tell him. His people had found the block. It came. 11 minutes later, not a breach charge, a shape cut clean and controlled, the sound of a tool rather than a weapon. Spec Ops says had sent the quiet ones. The node room was the hardest fight in. The station, the Voreth defending it, were their best, tighter, faster, and more coordinated than anything the boarding teams had faced so far. They had fortified the room with portable shield emitters and overlapping fields of fire, and they had clearly been told that the node did not fall regardless of cost. Bryce's element hit them from the eastern corridor. The western team hit the shield emitters with captured phase disruptors on settings they had worked out from battlefield observation. Certain configurations interfered with the emitters from the outside. It took 3 attempts to find it. The third attempt worked. The room opened up. What followed was not elegant. It was human. Boarding teams in close quarters with Voreth soldiers who were still the most dangerous individual fighters they had encountered, and it was brutal, loud, fast, decided by margins too small to plan for. The node stood at the center of the room, a column of black architecture. Rice reached it with the charge he had been carrying since the first corridor, and set it with the care of a man who understood there would not be a second attempt. The detonation was contained, precise. The node came apart from the inside. The effect moved through the station like a wave. Voreth soldiers across every corridor lost whatever had been coordinating them. It did not kill them, but the precision fell away, and units that had moved as one became individuals, making their own decisions under fire. Against humans in corridors, that was a different calculation. The boarding teams felt the shift before they understood it as engagements turned decisive and positions began to collapse. The Spec Ops team that cut through the detention block door found 7 cells. 6 empty, 1 occupied. Russell was sitting upright against the wall, hands flat on his thighs, blindfold in place. The team leader, a compact man named HFY, who had been briefed that Russell was the priority equal to the note, moved into the cell and stopped. Russell's head turned toward him. Russell, HFY said. Russell listened for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Once, okay. Favor your left side when you're moving. Tactically, I noticed it the first time. You trained with the Council security. Detail. Old injury or a habit. HFY looked at the blindfold and said nothing. For a moment both, he said. Russell put one hand on the floor and stood without assistance. He was steady. The blindfold was dark with old chemical staining at the edges, the medicine long since absorbed. He held out his right hand. HFY put a sidearm in it. Russell's fingers ran the weapon's geometry in 3 seconds. Grip, trigger, safety position, charge indicator by texture. He chambered it and held it at his side. His left hand he held out open, palm up. HFY put his hand in it. Russell's grip was not the grip of a man who needed guidance. It was the grip of a man who needed a fixed point to orient from. There was a difference, and HFY felt it immediately. Veracun is probably in the crystal ballroom. Russell said he's likely pulled his remaining force around the perimeter, waded toward the stage. Main doors are sealed, but the same disruptor settings your people used on the shield emitters should break them. There's also a maintenance access point on the northeastern wall corridor. Level, it doesn't appear on console. Schematics, it opens into the gallery. Above the ballroom floor, Akepper stared. At him. You have been in this cell for hours, he said. Russell's expression did not change. I know the station very well, Russell said. It breathes, you can hear it once. You learn how to listen. They moved. Russell navigated by memory and sound. And the fixed point of Akepper's hand on his shoulder, his own choice, his own terms, a tool rather than a support. Twice he redirected the team away from the routes they defaulted to, and both times the alternative proved faster and cleaner. The Voreth they encountered without the network were dangerous and determined and not enough. The nodes. Death had changed the arithmetic of the station, and the boarding teams were collecting the result corridor by corridor. The northeastern maintenance access was exactly where Russell said it would be. They reached the crystal ballroom gallery without being detected. Below them, the room was unrecognizable. The crystal tables shattered or overturned, the holographic banners dead, the transfer steel ceiling cracked in two places where something had impacted it from outside during the breach approach. Tharvix's body was still at the base of the podium. No one had moved him. Varikon stood at the center of the ballroom floor with his remaining force arranged around him. Exactly as Russell had predicted, he was not panicking, he was not retreating, he was a tech lord of the Voreth Dominion. And he was standing in the room he had taken and waiting for whatever came next, with the cold patience of a being who had not yet fully updated his assessment of the situation. Russell's hand found the gallery railing. His head moved in small increments, reading the room by the augmentation hum of the Voreth below, by the air currents, by the acoustic map he had built from hours of listening to a station breathe. He told Akepper exactly where each Voreth soldier was standing. Akepper looked at his team. Then he looked at the blind man holding the railing with one hand and a sidearm with the other. Russell's face was already turned toward the floor below, toward the point where the augmentation hum was strongest, toward Varric. On your call, Akepper said quietly. Russell's grip tightened on the railing. They breached. The gallery gave them the first 3 seconds. 3 seconds in a room full of augmented soldiers was enough if you used them correctly. Akepper's team used them correctly. They came off the gallery railing in a controlled drop, weapons already oriented toward the positions Russell had mapped from above, and hit the ballroom floor, moving simultaneously. The main doors came down from outside. Breach charges placed by the boarding teams who had been fighting through the station's western corridors and had arrived at the ballroom threshold 30 seconds ahead of schedule, because the node's death had turned what should have been a grinding approach into something closer to a pursuit. Varikon's force had been arranged for a single direction of threat. They got to, without whatever had been coordinating them. The response was still fast. Individual Voreth soldiers were still among the most dangerous fighters in the station, but fast and coordinated were different things, and the difference showed immediately. Units that would have collapsed the flanks in the first seconds instead made individual decisions that created gaps, and the boarding teams and Akepper's people poured through the gaps with a focused aggression of soldiers who had been fighting toward this room since they hit the station hull. The crystal ballroom became something it had never been designed to be, a Battlefield. Russell came off the railing last. He did not jump blind. He took the railing in both hands and went over it. Controlled, dropping the distance he had calculated from the sound of his teammates landing, and hit the floor in a combat crouch with his sidearm up and his head already turning. The ballroom resolved around him in sound and air pressure and the specific frequencies of augmentation technology. Operating at combat intensity, a cluster of signatures distinct enough to give him position and movement. He had been building this map since the gallery. He did not need to update it. He needed to move through it. The first Vorath came at him from the left, drawn by the sound of his landing, moving with the precision of a soldier who had fought humans before and knew to close distance fast and not give them room to think. Russell heard the weight shift 2 steps before the commitment and was already turning into it inside the reach of the phase disruptor before it could be brought to bear, and what he did in the next 4 seconds was not something that required eyes. The Vorath went down. Russell was already moving toward the next signature. He did not chase. He read the room and found the angles where the fight would come to him, and he was there when it arrived. A blind man in a ballroom full of augmented soldiers should have been a casualty in the first 30 seconds. Russell was a casualty in the way a detonation is a casualty, something that removes itself from the equation by removing everything around. At first, the Vorath he encountered did not understand what they were fighting until it was too late to adjust. By then it did not matter. Varicon read the room with the cold clarity of a being who had commanded enough engagements to know when one was unrovable. The node was gone. His force was engaged on 2 fronts without coordination. Humans were not fighting the way his tactical model said humans fought. They were faster in close quarters, more aggressive, less predictable than his models accounted for. The ballroom was lost. The engagement was lost. The war wasn't lost. The war had not yet begun. In any meaningful sense, Varicon was one tech lord and there were others. The force he had brought here was not the full measure of the dominion he needed. The command deck he needed to reestablish contact and coordinate the next phase before the humans consolidated their position on the station. The engagement here was a setback. Setbacks were recoverable. He moved. 4 of his most heavily augmented soldiers formed a perimeter around him, and they pushed toward the northeastern corridor, the route to the command deck, the route he had already identified as the cleanest exit from the ballroom. They moved with purpose, without hesitation. Varicon did not believe he was losing. He believed he was adapting. Russell heard Varicon move, not guessed, heard the specific augmentation signature he had cataloged in the detention cell, the complex layered hum of a tech lord's modifications running at full output, distinct from every other signature in the room. The way voice is distinct from noise. He had been tracking it since the gallery, through the drop and the landing and the 3 Vorath he had put down since that signature had been a fixed point in his map of the room, and now it was moving toward the northeastern corridor, and Russell knew what was in the northeastern corridor because he knew this station he did not follow. Following was the wrong geometry. He cut 15 years of walking Solve Prime's corridors gave him the angle route through the eastern edge of the ballroom that would bring him to the northeastern corridor mouth before Veron's perimeter reached it. He moved fast, and he moved clean, and twice he stepped around debris he could not see, because the acoustic return from his own footfalls told him it was there. HFY saw what Russell was doing from across the ballroom. He pulled two people and went wide to the left toward the other side of the corridor mouth without being told to. He had only been watching Russell for seconds, but it was enough to understand what he was seeing. The corridor mouth had two approaches. Russell took one, HFY's people took the other. Veron walked his perimeter into a corner. He looked at the two humans blocking the corridor mouth, looked back at the ballroom where the sounds of his remaining force being systematically dismantled were becoming less frequent in the specific way that meant the dismantling was nearly complete. Then he looked at Russell. Russell was standing at the corridor mouth with a sidearm at his side and his head turned at the slight angle of a man orienting by sound. The blindfold was dark and still. His face was calm in the way that empty rooms are calm, not peaceful, not resolved, simply absent of anything that was not necessary. Veron raised his weapon. The shot went wide. Russell had heard the targeting adjustment in the shift of Veron's weight, the slight forward transfer that preceded the arm coming up, the barely perceptible change in the augmentation hum as the weapon system powered to fire, and he had moved before the decision to fire was fully executed. Not far enough. He closed the distance. Veron was larger, augmented, stronger by any measurable standard. He fought with the precision of a being whose modifications had been designed for exactly this kind of engagement, and in the first seconds, he was winning in the way that a superior tool wins against an inferior one when the metrics are straightforward. Russell did not fight on straightforward metrics. He fought in the specific way that a man fights when he has nothing left to lose, and 60 years of knowing exactly where bodies break. He absorbed what he had to absorb and did not stop. He took damage that should have slowed him and used the momentum of it instead of fighting it. He found the left leg, the asymmetric one, the one whose augmentation hum had been slightly off since the detention cell, the weakness Veron did not know he had mapped, and he broke it. Veron went down on the floor. He was still dangerous, and Russell knew it and did not give him the seconds he needed to become dangerous. Again, what Russell did next was not something that required description. It required only that it be done completely. HFY's people arrived at the edge of it. They did not intervene. There was nothing left to intervene in. When it was over, Russell stood. He was breathing hard. His left side was damaged in ways that would need attention. His hands were wet. He stood with his head slightly bowed and his sidearm at his side and didn't move for a moment. Then he turned not toward HFY, not toward the sounds of the boarding teams finishing the last of the Voreth in the ballroom behind him. He turned toward the place he had known with the precise certainty of a man who had held someone there and never forgotten it, the base of the podium. He crossed the ballroom floor slowly. The sounds of the fight behind him were tapering, isolated, terminal, the last notes of something concluding. His boots found the step at the base of the stage, and he stopped. He did not crouch. He did not reach down. He stood at the edge of where Tharvix had fallen and was still and quiet in the way that only people who have run out of things to do with their hands are quiet. HFY watched from across the room and did not speak and did not move toward him. Nobody did. The ballroom was silent for the first time since the lights had died. They found Rice near the node room. He had made it through the fight, through the corridor collapse he had called down on his own approach route through the node room and everything inside it. He had made it to within sight of the ballroom doors before something caught him in the final exchange with the last Vorith perimeter element. He was sitting against the wall with his back straight and his legs out in front of him and his weapon still in his hand, which was the way soldiers who knew they were not getting up again chose to sit. HFY stood over him for a moment, then he moved on. There was still work to do, and Ree would have told him to keep moving. The station was secured, but the cost made the word feel hollow. Sulf Prime breathed again, its systems partial, its corridor scarred, its crystal ballroom a ruin that no amount of reconstruction would make into what it had been before the attack. The holographic banners were gone. The transparent steel ceiling was cracked in 2 places. The crystal tables were fragments underfoot. Nobody celebrated. There was nothing in the boarding teams that wanted to celebrate. They had taken the station back, and the station felt like a grave. And celebration would have been a kind of lie that none of them had the energy. For they gathered their dead, tended their wounded, and secured the surviving Vorith with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood the work. Did not stop just because the shooting had the surviving council representatives had been moved to a secondary conference room on the station's upper level, smaller than the ballroom, functional, the kind of room used for working sessions rather than ceremonies. They sat or stood or arranged themselves according to whatever posture their biology used for shock and uncertainty. They were leaderless in a way that went beyond the absence of a single individual. Tharvix had not merely led the council, he had been the architecture of it, the intelligence and the will and the particular quality of belief that had made 34 species decide 15 years ago that coexistence was worth the work it required. Without Lord Peace, the room did not know what it was. Russell came in last. He was still in council robes. The robes were ruined. The blindfold was dark at the edges, and his face above and below it carried the specific stillness of a man who had spent everything he had and not yet decided whether to look for more. HFY's hand was not on his shoulder. He had not asked for it since leaving the ballroom. He found the wall inside the door and put his back to it and said nothing. The room looked at him. He was the senior human representative. He was the closest friend of the being who had built this coalition. He was blind and bloodied and standing without assistance in the specific way that said the standing was a decision rather than a default. One of the council members spoke, an elder of the Sarathi, a species whose diplomatic tradition required that grief be acknowledged before business was conducted. He said Tharvix's name the way his people said the names of the dead, with a particular elongation of the final syllable that meant something. Russell did not have the cultural framework to fully translate, but understood completely anyway. Russell let the silence after it sit for a moment. Then he spoke, not loudly, not with the cadence of someone delivering a speech to an audience that needed to be moved but with the flat precision of someone describing a situation to people who needed to understand it. Tharvex is dead, he said. The shot came from the Arconian side of the room. That is a fact this council will have to carry, and I will not make it easier than it is. What I will tell you is that the Voreth did not come here for a station. If you think this ends here, you're wrong. Veriquen was the announcement. What comes behind him is the message. Nobody spoke. Russell's head moved slightly, reading the room by its silence, the quality of the breathing, the small sounds of species processing something they did not have a framework for. You have two options, he said. You find a new framework or you find new terms of surrender. Those are the only two things available to you right now. I know which one Tharvex would have chosen. He pushed off the wall and left. Sayes came aboard through the primary docking collar with two aides he immediately sent in the other direction. And no ceremony, he walked the station's main corridor from the docking collar to the crystal ballroom because he knew Russell would be there. Russell was standing at the base of the podium, still in the same position Sayes had seen on the feed before the arrest, though everything else was different. Now, Sayes stopped beside him. He looked at the blindfold. He looked at what the blindfold covered. He looked at the dried blood on Russell's face and hands, and ruined robes. He looked at the podium and at the base of it and at the floor. You got here fast, Russell said. I was already moving, Sayes replied. Russell made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but it carried acknowledgement and a quiet note of gratitude for something he had expected and counted on. They stood together at the base of the podium where Lord Peace had fallen, and said nothing for a moment. Describe the display when we get there, Russell said. I will. They left the ballroom together. Russell's hand found Sayes's arm at the elbow, a light contact. They walked at the same pace without needing to adjust. The tactical display in the station's operations center showed the second Voreth fleet in the flat cold language of long-range sensors, mass signatures, approach vector, estimated transit time. The officer who had been monitoring it stepped back when Sever entered and did not return to the console. The council representatives who had followed from the conference room arranged themselves around the edges, watching the display. Sayes and Russell approached the display. Tell me, Russell said. Severus told him. Mass signatures that made Veron's force look like a customs patrol. 3 distinct command signatures indicating 3 tech lords, not 1. Estimated transit time that left no margin for anything resembling preparation. Russell was quiet. The room was quiet. Around him, the council representatives had heard the description. Several of them had the particular stillness of beings recalculating survival odds and not finding the results useful. One of the Sarathi elders closed his eyes. A Dravathi representative, a species whose biology expressed distress through a barely audible subsonic tone, had been producing that tone since the description began. Severus, Russell said. Yes, we're not done, Russell said. Sayes nodded and turned back to the display. He studied the shape of what was coming. He raised his hand and set it against the display, his fingers moving slowly across the cold surface, tracing the incoming fleet. Outside the station, in the dark between stars, the Voreth fleet continued its approach, patient, massive, certain of what it was coming to collect. Peace had lasted 15 years. War was considerably more patient. 24 hours ago. Peace is what brought us together. Peace is what allowed 34 civilizations to flourish, not in spite of their differences, but because of what they chose to build beyond them. The words of Tharvix, High Chancellor of the Council, settled over the crystal ballroom of Solfege Prime. This was their annual commemoration of 15 years without war. Then a single shot ended it. A long-range plasma round broke the silence of the crystal ballroom. Tharvix folded at the podium. In the chaos that followed, delegates in panic, security moving every direction, the lights of the ballroom suddenly too bright and the noise suddenly too loud. Tharvix saw who had fired, an Arconian, his own people. Selûne, chief of the council guard. The betrayal landed harder than the shot itself, harder than the pain spreading through his body and the feeling of his legs losing the strength to hold him. Everything slowed the way things slow when the body understands what the mind has not yet accepted. He saw Russell pushing through the mass of bodies, forcing passage, moving with the particular determination of a man who had been a warrior, not for the violence of it, but for what violence could protect. Tharvix had always respected that about him. He fell, but before his body reached the floor, Arconian marble, white and faintly blue, polished to the kind of smoothness that takes generations. Russell caught him, his best friend. Tharvix gathered the last strength he had. He reached for Russell's sleeve and pulled him close. Russell brought his ear to his mouth. Peace is always worth it, Russell. Breath, the last one, fight for it. He closed his amber eyes. Lord Peace was dead. Present time. Sayes had not moved his hand from the display. 3 days until Drathal's nearest fleet element arrived, and the margin for anything resembling preparation collapsed into zero. He turned to face the room. Behind him the council was already destroying itself. Tark Soven moved first. The Celt delegate had the build of a species that resolved disagreement through momentum and the patience of one that did not. He planted himself at the center of the room like something that had decided to become an obstacle. We strike now before they complete their approach. Every hour we spend in this room is an hour their positioning improves and ours doesn't. His gaze moved across the room with the particular quality of a species that considered hesitation a character defect. Sayes has a fleet. We have fleets. The math is simple. Nouvel of the Runite did not move from his position along the wall. His species had learned long ago that stillness in a room full of agitated beings carried its own authority. The math, he said, with the precision of someone correcting a child, includes the fact that one of our own species may have just betrayed this council, and their ships are currently docked here. Before this council commits a single ship to unified offensive, it will address that. His eyes found Iraq Vol. The Argonian representative stood straight and said nothing. His command culture ran deep, and his capacity for shame ran deeper, and he did neither of the things Nunvel wanted, which were flinch or argue. The shot came from the Aronian side of the room. Nanvel continued, this council does not move forward as though that fact does not exist. That fact, Tark Soven said, turning on him, exists whether we move or not. What also exists is a fleet 3 days out that does not care about our internal proceedings. Left soon the Valor delegate raised. One hand, a gesture a species used to signal that the emotional temperature of a conversation had exceeded its productive threshold. Both positions assume that unified resistance is viable. His voice carried the careful precision of a species that treated language as engineering. The incoming force represents a scale of engagement that this alliance, in its current condition, cannot meet. There are channels worth exploring that do not require us to spend what we cannot afford to spend. The word channels landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Tarkovin made a sound as species used for contempt. Channels, he said the word the way you say the name of something you have found in a place it should not be. You want to open channels with what is coming. I want this council to survive, Leth soon said. I'm open to examining every available path toward that outcome. I did not say I had selected one. You implied it. I implied nothing. I stated a position. The distinction matters. Mercy Th had not spoken. The Dravathi representative stood near the far wall, with the particular stillness of a species processing something it did not have a framework for. When he spoke, the room heard it immediately because his subsonic distress tone had been a constant presence since the night before, and now it was gone, which meant he was past distress and into something colder. My government is reviewing our fleet's position here, each word placed with the flatness of a species that had already made a decision. Dravathi home systems are not positioned to absorb the scale of engagement that display represents. Our presence in this alliance was predicated on a collective defense capability that I am no longer certain exists. Then you die alone, Tarkovin said, not cry, as a statement of tactical fact. We may die either way, Morn Kath replied. At least alone we choose where. The Sarathi elder opened his eyes. He looked at the room with the quiet gravity of a species whose diplomatic tradition required that grief be acknowledged before business was conducted, and had been watching this room conduct business over grief since the moment the feed from Solf Prime's ballroom had gone dark. We are performing the enemy's work for them, he said quietly. Every word spoken in this room against each other is a word that does not need to come from outside. Silence, brief, the kind that follows a truth nobody wanted stated aloud, non-veal. Broke it, sentiment, he said. The Sarathi elder wants unity. Unity did not protect Lord Peace. Unity did not prevent the shot. What this council requires is accountability before it requires anything else, and accountability begins with the Arconian fleet standing down. Iraq Von moved for the first time, one step forward. His voice, when it came, was the voice of a species whose command culture did not permit self-pity but had no rule against precision. The Argonian fleet will accept whatever conditions this council requires. He did not look away from Nunville. Stand down, disarm. Cede command. We do not contest what happened. He paused, but understand this: every ship you sideline is one you won't have in 3 days. The enemy knows that. That's why the shot came from our side of the room. Tarksovin looked at Iraq Vol with something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it. 2 of the smaller delegates near the back had been moving toward the door for the last several minutes in the incremental way of species that do not want to be seen. Leaving, they had almost reached it. Russell stood up. He had been against the wall since Severus turned from the display, seated still in ruined robes. The blindfold dark at its edges, his hands rested flat on his knees, his face angled slightly upward, not searching the darkness but listening. 15 years on the station had not left him when his sight did. He tracked the room by sound now, voices, shifts of weight, the small changes in breathing. The way you track something you know well enough that it no longer requires thought. He stood and the room settled on him the way rooms do when the person who matters decides to move. He did not speak immediately. He let the attention settle. Iraq Vaughn is right about one thing. His voice carried the calm precision of someone describing a situation to people who needed to understand it. The shot came from the Argonian side of the room because someone put it there. That is not Arconian guilt, that is enemy operation. The difference matters because one of those things costs us ships and the other costs us nothing, except the assumption we walked in with. He turned toward Noonville. The Argonian fleet stays armed and stays docked, not because they have earned it, because the Tech Lord Drathel arrives in 3 days and performing punishment for an enemy's operation is exactly what that enemy wants us doing right now. Nonville opened his mouth. I know, Russell said before he could speak. It is not enough. It does not resolve the question. It postpones it. I am asking you to postpone it because we do not have the margin to resolve it today and survive tomorrow. He turned toward Lethsoon. There are no channels. The tone of someone describing geography. There is this council or there is the sequence in which you are individually removed. That is the complete list of available options. Every hour you spend looking for a third option is an hour Calvorin and Siraketh uses to close another corridor. Lethsoon was still. Russell turned toward Morn. CTH, your home systems are 3 days away from this fleet and 2 days away from the next one. Distance is not protection, it is just the order in which you are reached. A beat stay, not for the alliance, for the math. Morn. CTH looked at the display at the 3 different mass signatures at the numbers that did not improve, regardless of which direction you approached them from. He did not move toward the door. Russell turned toward the center of the room, toward all of them. Tharvax built something that held for 15 years. It held because he understood that 34 species agreeing on anything is a miracle, and you do not waste miracles on pride. He stopped. The weight of the name in his own sentence was visible in the half-second before he continued. His last words to me were, fight for peace. We vote on unified command under Says. We vote now not because it is comfortable, because it is the only move left that doesn't hand them the win before the first shot is fired. The room was quiet, not an agreement, but the particular quiet of a room that has stopped fighting itself long enough to hear something true. Then the communications panel opened. No announcement, no frequency identifier. For a moment there was only the shift in the room, attention pulling towards something that had not yet spoken. Then she did. Her voice settled into the space, low, calm, charming. I am Tech Lord Siraketh of the Vorith Dominion. She let that sit, not as a threat, as context. Then she pronounced it correctly. The final syllable carried the Sarathi elongation used for the dead. The Sarathi elder went still. I studied him, she continued her tone even. What he built was remarkable. 34 species choosing alignment over conflict is not a small achievement. A brief pause. It was also costly. No emphasis, no push. The word stood on its own. The shot came from the Arconian side of the room. What an irony. Silence spread through the chamber. Quiet and active, her voice shifted. Slightly warmer. I am not here to demand surrender. That term is inaccurate for what follows. I am offering survival. She gave the room time to absorb it. A framework in which 33 species retain their systems, their populations, and their future. A framework that does not require continued sacrifice for a belief that has already cost your Lord peace. Another pause. This framework is not available to all 34. She did not clarify. Movement began at the edges of the room. Morn CTH turned toward the door. 2 smaller delegates moved with him. Russell said nothing to them. He turned toward the communications panel toward her. When he spoke, there was no heat in it, no urgency, no strain, only the steady voice of a man who had already understood what he was facing. You chose a formal council proceeding, he said deliberately. You wanted the room already listening before you began. The weight of it, the authority. You prepared this long before Vericon ever reached this station. The broadcast did not respond. Russell continued without rushing. You said 33 species, not 34. You left us out carefully enough that everyone here completed that thought themselves. A brief pause. You didn't exclude us because we're the threat. You excluded us because we're the answer. If we didn't matter, you would have included us and let us disappear quietly. You didn't. That tells me everything I need to know. There was a pause from the broadcast. Then her voice returned, not louder but sharper now, the softness stripped to something more dangerous. The answer, she said. Tell me, counselor, how many answers does a blind man provide? You stood in that ballroom while Lord Peace died within reach of your hands, hands that failed him in time, and now eyes that cannot see what is coming. A slight pause. You held 15 years of peace together and could not hold one room. What exactly are you the answer to? The room stilled. Russell did not move. He stood with the composure of a man who had already decided what to do with it. When he spoke, his voice had not changed. Everything you just said is true. Tharvix is dead. I am blind. The room nearly broke. He turned slightly, addressing the council as much as her. And she needs you to hear that. She needs you to see weakness to finish the calculation. And she started to believe. The doubt is yours and not hers. He faced the panel again. You studied Tharvex. You learned how his name is spoken for the dead and used it to make this room grieve instead of think. I knew him for 15 years. Do not tell me what his death cost. You don't have the range for it. The broadcast cut. No. Farewell. No reply. Morn CTH had stopped moving toward the door. The room was quiet in a different way than before. Russell turned to face the room. He let the silence from the closed broadcast sit for 1 second. She's gone. Surrender or fight. That's the only question left in this room. Nobody spoke. Surrender. Walk out that door. I will not stop you. Nobody moved. Fight. Then it happens like this. Your technology, our command, everything you have will be placed under Saze's command. One structure, one authority. Drathel has already calculated every fleet in this room. The only thing that beats him is something he hasn't. He waited. One by one they nodded. Russell turned toward Says, "They're yours." The first thing they learned was that alien weapons did not fit human hands, not metaphorically. Physically, a Kelt pulse cannon was built for a species with a grip span 40% wider than a human hand and a recoil tolerance built on a skeletal structure that absorbed impact differently than bone and muscle. The first human soldier who fired one without modification hit the target and broke 2 fingers doing it. He taped the fingers and asked for another shot. That was the first hour. By the 6th hour, the human engineers had modified 9 different weapon systems from 4 different species, not redesigned. Adapted bracing mechanisms, grip reductions, trigger sensitivities recalibrated for human reaction times, which were faster than Sarathian, slower than Kelt, and different from both in ways that mattered when the difference between firing and not firing was measured. Fractions of a second. HFY was in the 3rd training rotation. He had not slept. Nobody in the preparation rotations had slept more than 4 hours, and most had not slept at all, which was the kind of detail that stopped mattering after the first 12 hours, because the alternative to not sleeping was not being ready, and not being ready was not available. He stood at a Sarathi weapon station that had been partially modified for human grip and ran the targeting sequence for the 4th time, and got it right for the 4th time, and moved to the next station without being told to. The Sarathi instructor, a species that communicated approval through a specific lowering of its secondary eyelids, lowered them as HFY moved past. HFY did not see it. He was already at the next station. The aliens learned differently. Dravathi pilot could not run human evasion patterns the way a human pilot ran them. His biology processed spatial rotation differently, and his instincts fought the maneuvers every time. What he could do was understand the logic of them, why they worked. The human doctrine of making yourself unpredictable, not through randomness, but through a specific kind of controlled aggression that looked like chaos from the outside and was not. He ran the patterns wrong by Devatha standards and right by every standard that mattered. And by the 10th hour he was running them faster than the human pilots who had taught him. The Kelt did not need to be taught aggression, they needed to be taught patience. The specific human understanding that aggression applied at the wrong moment was indistinguishable from failure. A Kelt commander named Torek Sen spent 2 hours arguing with a human tactical officer about the difference between striking first and striking correctly before he understood that the human was not telling him to hold back. He was telling him to wait for the moment when holding back became the most aggressive thing he could do. Torek Sen did not argue after that. SFG Prime's corridor smelled like weapons, discharge, and alien biology, and 36 hours of preparation compressed into something that was not quite an army and not quite an alliance, and was becoming incrementally and painfully both. In the medical bay, Russell did not know any of this. The doctor, a human physician attached to the council staff, who had been treating diplomatic injuries for 11 years and had never treated anything like this, had found damage that the adrenaline of the previous 24 hours had hidden. 3 cracked ribs, a partial ligament tear in the left shoulder from the fight against Varicon's forces bruising along the left side that suggested an impact. Russell had not registered taking and could not remember, and the eyes, the sockets where Varicon had removed the implants, raw and inflamed and requiring treatment that would take time the rest of the station did not have. The doctor sedated him. He had been awake for 31 hours and his body had been making the argument for the last 6 of them. He was unconscious before the sit finished its work. Okafor took his post outside the medical bay door when the 3rd training rotation ended. He had not been assigned there. He had simply gone there, the way soldiers go to that place that makes the most sense when nobody has told them where to be. He stood with his back to the wall beside the door and did not move and did not sleep and watch the corridor traffic of a station preparing for war pass in both directions. The doctor came out, once checked that Okafor was there, and went back inside without saying anything. Sarah slept for 3 hours, no more, not out of fatigue, but because he needed his mind clear and fully focused for the war ahead. He held the War Council in the Operations Center 12 hours after the vote. Representatives from all fleet capable species along with the commanders and tactical officers who would be making decisions once the shooting started. He did not hold a briefing. A briefing implied information flowing in one direction. What he ran was faster and uglier than that. Series of direct questions and direct answers and direct corrections when the answers were wrong, which they sometimes were, and nobody in the room was given the luxury of feeling bad about being corrected because there was no time for it. He laid out Drathel's doctrine in 4 sentences: overwhelming force, direct assault, no subtlety. He does not adapt mid-battle because he has never needed to. Then he laid out the formation he intended to use, something no single species would have designed alone because no single species would have had the components for it. Human aggression at the tip, Sarathi, precision on the flanks, cult mass at the center holding the shape of it together while everything else moved. The Dravathi running interference patterns that would make the formations edges look softer than they were. The Argonian fleet held in reserve, not punishment, not distrust, positioning. The reserve was the sharpest instrument in the formation, and he intended to use it as one. The commanders looked at the formation, and several of them understood immediately, and several of them did not. And the ones who did not asked questions and got answers, and the ones who still did not were given a specific task within the formation that did not require them to understand the whole of it. An Arconian fleet commander, young, precise, carrying the particular stillness of a species performing atonement through function, asked severe directly what he wanted from the Aronian reserve. Severus told him exactly. No softening. The commander nodded once and asked no further questions. Council broke. The commanders returned to their ships. Some of them looked at the display on their way out. Some of them did not. Drath, the Annihilator, arrived at R48 1 day earlier than projected. The sensors picked up the transit signature 20 minutes before emergence. Enough time. Sayes had been monitoring the approach vectors since hour 30 and had moved the fleet to its position at hour 42, 6 hours before emergence, which meant that when Drath Thur came out of transit, he did not find a station scrambling to respond. He found a formation already waiting for him. The pause in Drath's advance lasted 4 minutes of sensor sweeps and signal analysis and whatever passed for recalculation in a tech lord whose doctrine had never required recalculation before. Sayes watched the pause on the display and said nothing. He had expected it. He had planned for exactly this length of it. What he had not planned for was the transmission. Drathel did not broadcast to the Council. He broadcast to his own fleet, an internal frequency that the Sarathi Signals Intelligence Team had broken 17 hours earlier and had been monitoring since. The transmission was brief, 3 seconds, a single phrase in Vorath military dialect that the translator rendered as they are flying together. Not a question, an observation delivered in the tone of something encountering a variable it had not included in its calculations and did not have an immediate category for. 34 species operating as one structure under human command was not a scenario Drathel had prepared for, because it was not a scenario that had existed before. 48 hours ago, then he attacked. His doctrine did not permit extended recalibration, overwhelming force. Direct assault. He came in with everything he had along a single axis of approach, the way a species that had won every engagement through mass and momentum attacks committed, certain the full weight of his fleet moving as one instrument toward the center of Severus. Formation. The formation held the first exchange. Cost 3 ships, 2 Dravathi interceptors and a Kelt cruiser that took a direct hit to its drive section and went dark in 11 seconds. The Dravathi pilots were recovered. The Kelt crew was not. Tarkovan received the report on his flagship's bridge and said nothing and did not change his fleet's position by a single degree. Drathel pushed harder. His second wave was heavier than his first, the Annihilator's version of adaptation, which was not adaptation at all, but escalation, the doctrine that had always worked before, applied with greater force. The center of Sever's formation buckled under the weight of it. 2 Sarathi vessels pulled back 30 degrees to avoid catastrophic damage and created a gap that Drathur's lead elements pushed into immediately. Sayes let them in. The gap was not a failure, it was the mouth of something. The Sarathi vessels that had pulled back were already moving to close behind Drathel's lead elements. As they pushed through, the Kelt mass at the center compressed inward. The human vessels at the tip curved back along the flanks with the specific controlled aggression that looked like retreat and was not driving Drathel's lead elements deeper into a space that was getting smaller. Drathel's lead elements recognized the closing geometry 8 seconds before it completed. They transmitted the recognition back to the command ship, the flat, urgent language of units, reporting that something had gone wrong. Severus gave one order. The Argonian reserve struck Drathel's command ship from its weakest covered vector, the position Severus had held them in. 1. Drathel's formation had dismissed as irrelevant until it suddenly wasn't. The young Aronian fleet commander did not need to be told twice. He had been waiting 42 hours for one specific moment, and he executed it with the precision of a species performing something that had the weight of atonement behind it. Drathel's command ship absorbed 4 direct hits before its defensive systems failed. The 5th hit reached something critical, the signature on Severus's Display changed, collapsed. Went from the mass of a command vessel to the debris signature of something that had been a command vessel, the Annihilators. Fleet did not break immediately. Drathal's doctrine did not include contingencies for the loss of the command element because his doctrine had not included the possibility. They pushed for another 9 minutes with the momentum of a force that had not yet processed what had happened to it. Then the signal stopped, the formation dissolved into individual vessels making individual decisions and individual vessels making individual decisions against a unified formation were not a problem, they were targets. The battle was over in 40 minutes. The cost was 11 ships, 4,300 crew across 7 species. The Kelt cruiser, the 2 Dravathi interceptors, 1 human frigate running on damaged systems since the opening exchange, 7 other vessels from 4 other species that had voted yes in an operations center 24 hours ago and had meant it when they nodded. Severe stood at the display and looked at the cost for 30 seconds. Then he turned to his tactical officer and began the process of repositioning for recovery operations. Nobody celebrated. They had won, and the winning felt like what it was, the first part of something, not the end of it. Akapper entered the medical bay when the battle signatures on his handheld display went quiet. Russell was awake. The sedation had run its course, and he sat in the medical bay with the particular stillness of a man who had known something was happening beyond his reach, with nothing to do but wait. Akapper pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. Talk, Russell said. Akapper talked. He did not soften anything. The battle, the formation, how Sayes had held the Argonian reserve for 42 hours and used them at the one moment Drathur had not covered. The cost, the 40 minutes, the way it ended. Russell listened closely. When Akapper finished, he said, Calvorin. It was not a question. Akapper glanced at the handheld display. The new signatures had appeared 50 minutes after Drathur's fleet dissolved. They were already closer than their last position, advancing with the same patient geometry. A fleet that had watched everything and decided its next move before anyone else had. Yes, he said. How long? Russell asked. 50 minutes. Akapper said. Is Sarah still at the display? Yes, then he already knows what I'm going to say. Akapper waited to him anyway. Russell added. Calvorin, the strategist, had been outside weapons range for the entire engagement, watching. His fleet had not moved during the battle, not to assist Drathal, not to press an advantage, not to do anything except observe. The strategist had watched Severus fight, and had watched the formation, and had watched the Ironian reserve close from the uncovered vector, and had watched Drathal's command ship go dark. He had watched all of it, and he had learned all of it. Now he repositioned. He moved his fleet with the patience of someone rearranging a space before beginning work in it. The corridor Severus had used for the Argonian reserve approach closed. The flanking vectors, the D-Vatha interceptors, had run closed. The gap the Sarathi vessels had created, the mouth of the trap closed. Every move Sever had made in the last 40 minutes accounted for, catalog sealed. The tactical officer looked at the updated display and said nothing. Severe studied the new geometry. He traced the positions. He found what Calvorin had left open and understood immediately that what had been left open had been left open. deliberately because Calvorin wanted him to use it. HFY's message arrived on the Operations Center display, 4 words. From Russell via HFY transmitted from the medical bay. He already knows, find. New Says read at once, then he raised his hand and set it against the display, and began looking for something Calvorin had not seen yet, outside SFG Prime in the dark between the wreckage of Drathal's fleet. The strategist waited. He had seen everything Says knew how to do. Now he wanted to see what Says would do next. Says had not left the display. The wreckage of Drathal's fleet was still cooling in the dark outside Sulf Prime when he found it, the thing Calvorin had not seen, not because it was hidden, because no commander who valued his fleet would consider it. It was harsh and direct, and it would cost ships he did not have margin to lose. And it was the only move available that Calvorin's calculations could not have accounted for, because those calculations were built on a fundamental assumption that the commander on the other side valued survival over victory. Says called the commanders back. They came without ceremony. Some of them had not left the operations center. Some of them had been on their flagships and came back through docking corridors that still smelled like the previous battle. They arranged themselves around the display, and Says showed them what he had found and did not soften what it would cost. The Sarathi elder, who had been present and silent since the vote, looked at the formation on the display for a long moment. Then he looked at Says. "You are asking us to be the gap?" He said. "Yes," Sarah said. The Sarathi elder was quiet, his species diplomatic. Tradition required that the weight of a decision be fully felt before it was made. He felt it, then he nodded. Torek Sen, the Celt commander, who had spent 3 hours arguing about patience and had not argued since, looked at the section of the formation assigned to his fleet. He looked at what it would require. He made the sound his species used when something was exactly as difficult as it should be, and nowhere near difficult enough to refuse. When he said, "When he commits," Says said, "Not before." Torek Sen nodded. One by one the commanders confirmed, not enthusiastically, not with the energy of species that had just won a battle and believed winning was a pattern, with the particular steadiness of beings who understood exactly what they were agreeing to and had decided it was worth agreeing to. Anyway, the young Argonian fleet commander was last. He looked at his assigned position in the formation, the position that would take the most direct pressure when Calvorin's opening landed, and he looked at Severus and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "We will hold." Says looked at him. No," he said. The commanders left. Severe turned back to the display and waited for Calvorin to move. Calvorin moved at hour 6, not with the committed certainty of a force that had decided the outcome in advance. He moved the way a mind moved through a problem. Precisely, incrementally, each element placed to create a condition that the next element would exploit. His opening was not an attack. It was a question, a probing movement along the left flank of Severus's formation, designed to generate a response that would reveal the formation's internal logic. Says did not respond. Calvorin adjusted, pressed the left flank harder. The Dravathi interceptors on that flank held their position without the evasion patterns that had defined their role against Drathal, and that stillness was information. It told Calvorin that Says knew he was being read and was withholding his responses deliberately. Calvorin found that interesting. He shifted to the right flank harder. The Sarathi vessels there absorbed the pressure without pulling back, without creating the gap that had destroyed Drathel, and Calvorin recalculated again. Faster this time, running through the available responses and finding that Severus had removed all of them. Every move that had worked against Drathel was gone. The formation was not the same formation. It was something new, built from the same components, and it did not behave the way his calculations said it should. He pressed both flanks simultaneously. The formation buckled. 3 vessels on the left took significant damage: a Vor science ship, a human frigate already running on reduced capacity, and a Runai patrol vessel. All 3 took hits that would have forced them out of the previous engagement. None of them pulled back. Calvorin recalculated. The answer that came back was one he had not expected. The formation was not holding because it was strong. It was holding because it had decided to hold. And that was a variable his calculations did not have a reliable model for, because it was not a tactical decision. It was something else, something that had been built in an operations center after the death of Lord Peace, when 33 species had looked at a blind human counselor and nodded one at a time. He committed his center. It was the move Severus had been waiting for. The center of Calvorin's formation drove into the apparent weakness between the 2 pressured flanks, the gap that the damage had created, the space that looked like the mouth of an opportunity. 3 seconds after his center committed, Sayes gave the order he had been holding since the commanders left the operation center. The formation inverted, not partially, completely. The flanks that had been absorbing pressure became the closing arms of something that had been waiting to close since the battle began. The Celt mass that had been holding the center drove forward into Calvorin's committed force. From below, the Argonian reserve repositioned during the 6 hours Calvorin had spent probing hit from the vector that the commitment had exposed. It was not the same trap as Drathel's. It was harsher, more expensive. 3 more vessels were lost in the closing, their crews holding position long enough for the maneuver to complete. Calvorin's center was inside the closing formation when Sirith broadcast arrived. She did not enter the room the way she had entered it before. No pause, no calibration. Her voice was present, immediately calm, melodic, the register of something delivering information it had already processed and found satisfactory. I am withdrawing. The operations center went very still. My fleet will not engage. This is not a tactical decision. It is a final one. Pause, not for effect, not to manipulate, simply the pause of something that had completed its work and was taking a moment to confirm the completion. You have fought well, better than the model suggested. The cost of engagement at this point exceeds my strategic requirements. Another pause, shorter. This war is over. For me. The broadcast closed the same way it closed the first time. No farewell, simply absent, as though she had never been in the room at all. The tactical officer looked at Severus. Severus did not look away from the display. On the display, Calvorin's formation had gone still, not a tactical pause, but the pause of something processing new information in real time, already losing and reaching a conclusion it could not recover from. His center was inside the closing formation. His flanks were cut off. Siraith was not coming. Calverin sent one transmission, not two. Says to Siraith's fleet frequency, the frequency that was already moving away. The translator in the human command center rendered it in 3 words. You planned this. Then he stopped transmitting and drove his command ship forward into the closing formation at full power, not to change the outcome, but because it was the only move left, and he chose to make it. The Argonian reserve met him directly. Calverin's command ship went dark 17 seconds later. His fleet dissolved faster than Drathel's had, without the momentum of doctrine to sustain it, without a commander to hold its shape, without Sirakeith's arrival to chain the mathematics. Ships broke formation, decisions fragmented, they became targets. The battle was over in 33 minutes. Cost 14 ships, 11 others whose names were already being logged by tactical officers who understood that the logging was the first and most important thing that happened after the shooting. Stopped 6,100 crew across 7 species. Say stood at the display and looked at the cost. Nobody in the operations center spoke. The victory felt the same as it always had, not like an ending but like wait, the cost of getting here, the losses that could not be undone, and the knowledge that it all had to be carried forward, not set aside. Sayes turned from the display. Begin recovery operations, he said. All of them. HFY had been relaying the battle to Russell in real time, facts delivered in the flat, efficient language they had developed over the last 48 hours. Position, losses, movements, outcomes. Russell had been sitting up in the medical bay, his hands flat on his knees, his blindfolded face angled slightly upward in the posture that meant he was running the room by sound and information instead of sight. When HFY relayed Sirakeith's broadcast, Russell went very still. HFY finished the relay and waited. Russell said nothing for a moment. The medical bay was quiet around them. The doctor had stepped out. The corridor beyond the door was empty. The station had the particular silence of a place that had been holding its breath for more than 48 hours and had not yet decided it was safe to breathe. She's not withdrawing because the cost exceeds her requirements, Russell said. HFY waited. She's withdrawing because her requirements are met. Russell's voice carried the tone of someone stating a physical law. Vericun drawl. Kavoran, 3 tech lords, 3 fleets. Everything they had spent here against us. The pause. She didn't come here to win. She came here to make sure they didn't leave. HFY looked at the handheld display, at Siraith's fleet signatures, moving away from the engagement at a steady, controlled velocity, not fleeing, not retreating, departing. She goes back as the only tech lord left, HFY said, the most powerful one in her galaxy. Russell said, having spent nothing, lost nothing. She watched 3 of her rivals spend themselves against us and called it a campaign. The silence that followed was the silence of 2 people sitting with something that was true and large and not entirely possible to hold all at once. HFY looked at Russell, at the blindfold, at the ruined robes that had been replaced with medical clothing, at the man who had held a room together with 15 years of instinct and no eyes, and had understood in a medical bay what it had taken everyone else a war to see. Did we win? HFY asked. Russell was quiet for a moment. Outside Solfege Prime, in the dark, between the wreckage of two tech lord fleets and the remains of everything the Alliance had spent to survive Sierra. Keith's fleet continued its departure toward a galaxy she had just inherited, without firing a shot, for now, yes. Whether that's a permanent victory depends on what she does next. The corridor turned sideways, then the first Marine died. HFY did not look back. Looking back got people killed. He moved through the dark on sound, alone, rifle tucked tight, boots locking and releasing against the shifting floor. As gravity rolled again, the corridor screamed with false alarms overlapping. Voreth's signal burst, heat ghosts, and the wet metallic shriek of phase blades cutting through bulkhead plating. Somewhere ahead, 2 down, Scott said. Over comms, 3, HFY said. A pause. Then Scott understood. Karen. Gone. No one said anything after that. The world became breath, vibration, and distance. HFY dropped to one knee before the first Voreth shape came. Through the smoke, he did not see it. None of them were using visual feed. That was the point. Sight lied under Voreth interference. Sight panicked. Sight gave the enemy something to corrupt. The alien's left foot hit the deck a fraction heavier than the right. HFY fired twice. The first round struck armor. The second found the joint under the throat. The Voreth folded. Another came over it. Scott caught that one with a shock line and dragged it into the wall hard enough to break its neck assembly. Then something moved above him, too quiet for anything that size, and Scott's marker flashed yellow, then red. He hit the deck without a sound. HFY kept moving ahead through the noise rustles. Footsteps never changed pace. He moved somewhere beyond the smoke with the measured calm of someone walking a room he had already memorized before entering it. A phase whip cracked once in the dark. Metal sparked. A Voreth soldier made a short broken sound and went down. HFY shifted right. A blade passed through the space where his neck had been. He caught the attacker's wrist, turned with it, and drove the muzzle of his rifle under the armor seam. The shot punched through. Hot fluid sprayed across his glove. The smell hit a second later. Copper and chemical burn. Report, Russell said. His voice came from ahead and left. HFY answered while reloading. 1 effective, 2 critical, 3 dead. Enemy close. The corridor opened, not a door. The whole right wall separated into black segments and became a kill chamber. Voreth soldiers waited inside, 7 of them motionless until the geometry finished shifting. Then they came at once. HFY fired into the first 2 and ran dry. Russell stepped out of the smoke between him and the charge. He wore no helmet, no visual rig, only the dark glasses and the same UED marine combat armor as the rest of Ghost unit. He held a training blade in one hand and a dead Voreth rifle in the other. The first enemy swung high. Russell turned before the strike began. The blade passed his shoulder by less than an inch. His own knife went under. The arm found the soft gap and opened it. He used the falling body as cover, fired the captured rifle once, then threw it into the second attacker's face, hard enough to stagger it. HFY took the opening. He hit low, drove his shoulder into the Voreth's knee, and brought it down. Russell finished it before the thing even hit the floor. 3 more entered through the left. The sound changed. HFY heard it before he understood it. A low harmonic pulse under the alarms. Voreth command frequency, neural synchronization. The remaining enemies began moving as one. Russell stopped, the way a man stops to listen to rain before deciding where it will flood. Center note, he said. Aquifer scanned the dark by sound. Nothing. Too much interference, too much movement. Then he smelled it. Ozone. Not from the weapons, not from the ruptured conduits lining the corridor. Walls cleaner than that, sharper. The scent pulsed through the smoke in steady intervals, synchronized with the low harmonic frequency moving beneath. The alarms. Aquifer tilted his head slightly above, he said. A faint smile crossed Russell's face. Good. Aquifer pulled the last charge from his belt and hurled it toward the ceiling. The explosion turned the corridor white. Fragments of metal and burning composite rained down through the smoke as the harmonic pulse vanished. Instantly, somewhere above them, the hidden synchronization node died, and with it, the perfect coordination that had been driving the Voreth assault for the first time since the engagement began. The enemy movements fell out of rhythm. Ghost unit moved immediately. Aquifer drove forward through the smoke before the Voreth could recover, firing into the nearest silhouette at close range. While Russell advanced beside him, the corridor collapsed into brutal close quarters violence, fragmented movement, overlapping gunfire, blades striking armor hard enough to throw sparks across the dark. The Voreth were still faster than most species, still stronger, but the synchronization advantage was gone, and humans had spent 5 years learning how to fight them without ever relying on sight in the first place. The final Voreth reached Aquifer from behind. He sensed the movement too late. The blade drove through his side beneath the armor plating. His suit screamed warnings into his ear. He ignored them and stayed on his feet long enough for Russell to close the distance. Russell caught the attacker by the throat assembly, leaned close enough that the enemy's sensors should have read his breath, and drove the knife upward. The Voreth collapsed against him, then slid slowly to the floor. Silence hit the corridor all at once. Aquifer stood in the ruined corridor, breathing hard, one hand pressed to the wound in his side. Around him, bodies lay across the deck, human Voreth, broken shapes in emergency light. Russell stood at the center of it, all blade low, head tilted slightly, as if listening for one more mistake. None came. The room lights returned. The battlefield dissolved. Walls became smooth, black surfaces again. Training complete. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The sharp chemical smell of burned composite still lingered in the air while the chamber ventilation systems slowly began pulling the remaining smoke upward into narrow extraction vents hidden in the ceiling. Across the floor, bodies that had been corpses moments earlier pushed themselves upright with exhausted irritation rather than panic. Karen pulled off his helmet first, swearing under his breath as he checked the impact scoring across his chest plate. 3 seconds, Karen said from somewhere near the wall. You lasted 3 whole seconds longer this time. Scott looked at him. You died before me. Yeah, but I died professionally. A few tired laughs moved through the chamber. Aquifer stayed where he was, beside Russell, one hand pressed against the place where the training blade had punched through his armor during the final exchange. The simulation chamber prevented lethal trauma, not injury. Pain remained real, blood remained real. Ghost unit trained that way because hesitation inside the room became hesitation in combat, and hesitation Against the Vorath got people killed. Russell removed the training knife from his belt and handed it silently to one of the technicians approaching the platform around him. Ghost unit moved with the casual discipline of soldiers who had repeated this process enough times that even simulated death had become procedural. Nobody treated Russell differently. That had been his rule from the beginning. No assistance unless requested. No hesitation around the blindness. No adjustment in standards. Especially not for him. The chamber display pulsed once. Overhead. Incoming priority transmission, UED. Orbital command. HFY glanced up. Immediately, Russell tilted his head slightly toward the display. Savorus, he said, the holographic field activated. Above the center of the chamber a second later, General Marcus Hughes appeared, standing inside the operations center. Aboard orbital command, one hand braced against the edge of a tactical display that cast pale blue light across his face. The background behind him moved with controlled urgency. Officers crossing between stations, sensor feeds updating across layered screens. The low operational rhythm of a command center shifting toward alert status without fully entering it yet. Severus looked at Russell once, then at the partially dispersed members of Ghost unit still standing around the chamber. I hope I'm not interrupting family bonding time, he said. Scott answered. Immediately, HFY got stabbed again. Twice, Corinne corrected. Severus nodded. Once, good, tradition matters. They laughed, but something in Saurus's expression had already told them this was not a routine call. Around the chamber, Ghost unit began dispersing toward the outer corridors, armor still damp with sweat beneath the training seals. HFY remained where he was, beside Russell, one hand resting against the edge of the black training platform. The image of Saurus hovered above the display. Long-range detection arrays confirmed. Vorath fleet entering Council space 10 minutes ago, he said. Looked directly at Russell. The flagship signature matches the harvester of silence. A brief pause. Sireth is back. Russell said nothing. The dark glasses concealed his eyes, but HFY had spent enough years around him now to recognize the specific stillness that meant Russell was already reorganizing possibilities in his head. How far, he asked. Current trajectory puts them approximately 48 hours from Sulphy Prime. A sharp notification tone cut through the chamber, then 2 incoming communication requests appeared across the display simultaneously. Sarathi Consulate, Kelt War Command. The incoming requests appeared across the chamber display and simultaneously populated across Saru's command feed. That was fast, Saurus said. Russell tilted his head slightly. Put them through. The chamber lights dimmed a fraction as the connection opened. 2 holographic figures resolved above the display field almost immediately. The Sarathi Elder appeared first, robed in layered silver-white ceremonial fabric that reflected the chamber light. Still water. Age showed differently among the Sarathi, not through physical weakness but through an increasing stillness that eventually became difficult to separate from patience itself. He folded his hands calmly before him and regarded Russell with the quiet gravity that had carried him through every council crisis since before the Vorath War. A second display resolved into the towering form of Tarkovan, the Kelt commander, appeared in full combat uniform, broad shoulders nearly filling the display. He carried the contained aggression of someone who considered waiting a temporary inconvenience. The scar tissue on his face remained visible even beneath the dense scales of his species. He did not wait for introductions. So it's true, Tarkovan said, the Dominion and NBSP is back. The Sarathi elder closed his eyes briefly. Your people continue to possess a remarkable relationship with diplomacy, he said. Quietly, our relationship with diplomacy is why we're still alive. Tarkovan looked directly at Russell. Lord War, tell me. We're mobilizing fleets already. Russell remained motionless beside the training platform. We detected one fleet, he said calmly. Not an invasion force. Tarkovan made a low sound of irritation. She doesn't cross galaxies for conversation. No, Russell said she doesn't. The Sarathi elder studied him for a moment before speaking. Do you believe war is imminent? The room quieted slightly after the question, not because of fear, because the Sarathi elder was not prone to dramatic questions. He did not ask things for emotional effect. If he asked, it was because he believed the answer mattered. Russell considered for a second before answering. I think Sirath never moves without already understanding the second and third consequence of arriving anywhere. His voice remained even. Whether this becomes war depends on what she believes she gains by avoiding one. Tarkovan folded his arms. That sounds dangerously close to uncertainty. It's called accuracy, Cyrus replied before Russell could answer. If she wanted immediate conflict, the fleet composition would look different. Tarkovan shifted his attention towards Savor's hologram, and if this is positioning before escalation, then we'll know soon enough. The Celt commander seemed almost pleased by the answer. The Sarathi elder looked back toward Russell. You knew this day would come, Lord War, not accusation. Observation. Russell's expression did not change. Yes. Tarkovan gave a sharp nod. Good. Because half the council spent the last 5 years pretending the Vorith problem ended at SFGA Prime. He leaned slightly forward. Lord War, if she forces this galaxy into another conflict, hesitation will kill more worlds than aggression. Will, the Sarathi elder spoke without raising his voice, and fear will kill more worlds than patience. Tarkovan turned toward him immediately. Patience did not stop Varikun. No, the elder replied calmly, but neither would panic have done so. Silence stretched briefly between them. Then Russell spoke. We are not making decisions tonight. That ended the argument instantly. He turned slightly towards Savaris. Hologram. Double long-range reconnaissance. Coverage, I want movement projections. Updated every hour. Savaris nodded once. Already happening. The Sarathi elder lowered his head slightly in acknowledgement. Then we wait. Tarkovan looked dissatisfied by the concept, but accepted it with visible effort. For now, he said, the request arrived 19 hours after the first fleet detection. Not through military channels, not forced through council systems the way Sirath had done 5 years earlier. This time the transmission entered through formal diplomatic routing protocols that had not been used by the Vorith Dominion once during the entire war. The operations officer at SFG Prime checked the authentication sequence twice before forwarding it to the council chamber, then a third time because the request carried a designation no Vorith transmission had ever carried before. Supreme Dominion Authority, the chamber, was already assembled when the notification appeared across the central display. 34 species arranged beneath the high curved ceiling of the council hall, while tactical projections rotated silently above the recess command pit. At the chamber center, Russell sat beneath them in the high counselor's position, once occupied by Tharvex. Lord Peace had built the seat. Lord War inherited it. The title still sounded unnatural to some species, necessary to others. The chamber remained silent as the transmission request expanded across the display. Formal communication request the Vorith Dominion, authorized by Supreme Tech Lord Sireth. Taravan read it once and immediately leaned forward. No. The word landed with typical Celt subtlety. She arrives with a war fleet and requests diplomatic privilege like this. Is a trade negotiation. The Sarathi elder remained still beside the outer ring of delegates. She requested communication, he said quietly, not surrender terms. She requested orbital approach vectors. 24 hours after entering a realist galaxy, Space Tarkovan replied that distinction matters less than you think. Severus stood near the tactical display, rather than among the delegates, themselves uniform, immaculate hands. Behind his back, the military presence in the chamber had increased substantially since the transmission arrived, though Solfic Prime was attempting very hard to pretend otherwise. The fleet remains outside direct weapons range, Saras said. Formation spacing is controlled, no strike deployment pattern. So far, Tarkovan looked at him. So, your recommendation is trust. My recommendation, Cirrus replied evenly, is accuracy. The chamber quieted again. Russell had not spoken yet. He sat motionless beneath the suspended tactical projections, dark glasses concealing the ruined damage beneath them. Around him, the chamber carried the layered sounds of restrained tension, shifting fabric, controlled breathing, distant movement from security personnel repositioning beyond the hall entrances. Then Russell spoke. Accept the request. Tarkovan turned immediately. Lord War, she came here intending to be received, Russell said calmly, refusing contact after she followed protocol weakens the council politically before negotiations even begin, and allowing her onto this station could get people killed. Yes, Russell said. The simplicity of the answer silenced the chamber more effectively than argument would have. The Sarathi elder watched Russell carefully. You believe? She anticipated this debate. I believe Sireth anticipates most things. Nobody argued after that. The authorization was transmitted 12 minutes later. The Voreth response arrived almost immediately. A single diplomatic vessel would detach from the harvester of silence upon entering authorized orbital range around Sol Fiji Prime. Minimal escort, no weapons deployment. Beyond standard security protocol. Supreme Tech Lord Sira KTH formally requested permission to attend the Galactic Council Assembly in person, not through holographic transmission, not through intermediaries. In person, the approval passed by narrow majority. 24 hours later, the Harvester of Silence entered orbit above Sulphi Prime, even among the traffic density surrounding the station. The Voreth flagship dominated the tactical displays effortlessly, vast, black, geometric in ways that made several species uncomfortable to look at. For too long, its surface carried none of the visible weapon saturation expected from a vessel of its scale. That somehow made it worse. One shuttle detached from the flagship's lower structure and began its descent toward the station. No fighter screen accompanied it, no military display. Just one dark vessel crossing open space toward the same station where the Vorith Dominion had once tried to break Sulfa Prime in a single night. Inside Sulfage Prime, security forces quietly sealed 3 additional corridor sectors before the shuttle even reached docking range. Ghost unit deployed across the diplomatic ring without formal announcement. Marine detachments repositioned behind ceremonial security lines designed to appear less militarized than they actually were. The station looked calm. Every soldier aboard knew it wasn't. The double doors of the council chamber slid open. 4 Solf Prime security officers entered. First, their formation tight and disciplined as they crossed the outer threshold and took position along the central approach corridor. None of them looked comfortable with the assignment. Every species in the chamber understood what the last Voreth arrival to this station had caused. Then Sierra entered alone. Conversation across the chamber faded gradually, rather than all at once, fragments of discussion disappearing in uneven layers. As attention shifted toward the doorway, the council hall had hosted warlords, admirals, monarchs, and species old enough to remember the founding of interstellar civilization itself. None of them entered rooms casually. Saraki somehow made all of them seem aware of their own movement by comparison. She crossed the chamber floor with measured calm, neither hurried nor theatrical, her posture carrying the complete certainty of someone who expected the space around her to remain under control, because it usually did. The Vorith were not considered beautiful by most known species. Their features were too sharpened by engineered evolution, too visibly shaped by civilization that valued precision over comfort. Yet Sierra Kth carried those same traits with a refinement that altered the effect entirely. Her skin held a pale blue tone beneath the chamber lighting, smooth almost to the point of appearing artificial. Dark ceremonial attire flowed around her in layered panels woven with faint metallic threading that shifted subtly when she moved, as though something beneath the fabric remained active and responsive. Thin arcs of black metal curved back through pale silver hair, forming something between a crown and a neural interface without fully resembling either. Nothing about her appearance looked ornamental. Everything looked designed. Different species interpreted the effect differently. Some saw elegance, others saw authority refined into physical form. Several simply found themselves paying closer attention than they intended to. Russell noticed something else. The air changed slightly as she entered the chamber. Most species would never have detected it consciously. The shift was too subtle. Beneath the ventilation currents moving through the hall, Russell identified it immediately anyway. Blindness had forced him to sharpen every remaining sense after the war, but that alone would not have been enough. Over the last 5 years, he had studied Vorith physiology extensively, respiratory systems, hormonal response, pheromone, communication patterns, species released chemical signals almost constantly beneath normal speech and movement. Most civilizations never noticed them. Russell did. A controlled pheromonal release moved through the chamber air, now carefully calibrated beneath direct recognition. Thresholds designed not to dominate emotion but to soften resistance around the edges. Sarah Keith's gaze settled on him almost immediately. Russell remained seated beneath the suspended tactical displays, dark glasses concealing the damage beneath them, while the rest of the chamber reacted to her arrival. Small involuntary ways shifting. Posture interrupted, breath, attention pulling toward her, whether intended or not. Russell did not move at all. That seemed to interest her more than if he had. The Forest Station security officer stopped several meters behind her as she reached the center speaking circle. The chamber door sealed quietly at her back. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Sarah Keith inclined her head slightly toward the assembled council. My thanks to the Galactic Council of the Aurelius Galaxy for granting this meeting. Her voice carried through the chamber with a melodic warmth, easing tension without ever losing control of the room. Nothing about it sounded forced. That was part of what made it dangerous. She spoke the way some species administered anesthetic, carefully measured, impossible to notice fully until the effect had already begun. I recognized the significance of standing here again. She continued, 5 years ago this chamber stood at the edge of collapse. Several council members shifted slightly in their seats, unsettled by the memory. The Vorath Dominion has changed since that night. The conflicts between tech lords are finished. The succession wars are over. Her gaze moved slowly across the chamber. There is now a dominion, one command authority, one unified fleet structure. The statement settled heavily through the room. Russell listened to the silence that followed it. Sir continued in the same composed tone. My predecessors believed power existed primarily to impose submission through force. I consider that an inefficient use of civilization. Tark Sovin's expression hardened immediately, though he remained silent. The Aurelius Galaxy and the Vorath Dominion now stand as the two dominant powers across neighboring galaxies. She said continued hostility between structures of this scale serves no rational outcome. She let the sentence settle before continuing. I did not come to solve prime to offer surrender terms. A slight pause. I came to propose alliance. The chamber did not remain silent after the word alliance. Murmurs spread almost immediately through the delegate tiers. Different species reacting in different ways. Low tonal exchanges among the Sarathi, rapid overlapping speech from the Valar cluster, visible agitation from several smaller representatives positioned near the outer rings. Even the chamber lighting seemed sharper, somehow against the sudden movement of 34 civilizations, recalculating the meaning of what they had just heard. Tark Sovin broke first. The Celt commander leaned forward in his position, heavy hands resting against the edge of the council platform, as though physical restraint was the only reason he remained seated. You arrive in this galaxy with a war fleet, he said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. After your dominion murdered billions across a realist space, and you believe you can walk into this hall asking for alliance. The chamber quieted slightly around the question. Siraith turned toward him without visible irritation. I believe, she said calmly, that civilizations which survive war eventually face a choice between remaining trapped inside it or building something capable of outlasting. Vid. Tar Sovin's expression hardened further. You speak as though this was mutual. Damage. No, Sirath replied, I speak as someone who understands that your galaxy survived the Voreth Dominion because it adapted faster than my predecessors. Anticipated, her voice remained measured, almost conversational. That outcome deserves respect, whether I approve of it emotionally or not. That slowed the room, not because she had apologized, because she had not. She had simply acknowledged reality without defensiveness, and the precision of it left Tark Sovin momentarily without a clean line of attack. Sirath continued before the silence could fully settle. The Voreth Dominion now controls stable transit infrastructure across 2 neighboring galactic corridors. Our military capabilities exceed those of every fleet currently operating within the Aurelis galaxy, energy systems capable of supporting planetary populations for centuries without depletion, medical and cybernetic advancements your civilizations have not yet approached. Independently, she spoke the words without arrogance, which somehow made them feel larger. I unified my galaxy because endless internal conflict weakened it. Her gaze moved calmly across the chamber. I did not come here seeking territory. I came because stable civilizations should not waste themselves preparing endlessly for wars that no longer serve strategic purpose. Several delegates exchanged looks after that. Russell smelled another faint adjustment in the chamber air. The pheromonal balance shifted subtly toward reassurance while she spoke about stability and survival. Carefully controlled, carefully timed. Siraketh turned slightly toward Russell. For the last 5 years, she said, I have studied the post-war development of the Aurelis galaxy, its political structures, its military adaptation. A brief pause. Its humans. Attention sharpened across the chamber. In human diplomatic tradition, she continued, there exists a ceremonial framework in which 2 powerful houses formally unite in order to end future conflict between them permanently. Now the chamber became truly still. The Sarathi Ellers' attention sharpened, almost imperceptibly. Even Severus straightened slightly near the tactical display. Sirath's voice never changed. I believe the human term for this structure is marriage. The word hit the chamber like a bomb. Several delegates reacted immediately. Audible shock from the outer tiers. Abrupt movement among the smaller species clusters, one of the Vior representatives physically lowering his data slate in visible disbelief. Tark Sovin stared at her. The chamber waited. Then Surath spoke again with the same calm tone. I am formally proposing political and dynastic union between the Voreth Dominion and the Aurelis galaxy. Her eyes settled fully on Russell now. And I am asking Lord War to stand beside me as my counterpart. Nobody in the chamber spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from the atmospheric system circulating air through the vast council hall while the counselors tried to process what they had just heard. Russell remained silent long enough for the chamber tension to begin tightening into something physically uncomfortable. SRA Keith waited without impatience. Around them, the council remained caught between disbelief and calculation. Political implications of what she had proposed spreading outward faster than most species could process them cleanly. Russell finally leaned back slightly in The High Counselor's chair, you. Cross two galaxies, he said calmly. To propose marriage. A few uneasy reactions moved through the chamber at the bluntness of hearing. The word repeated aloud. Sir Keith did not appear disturbed by it. I crossed two galaxies, she replied, to prevent future conflict between powers that have already proven capable of destroying each other. Russell's expression did not change. Ambitious, he said, something faintly resembling amusement touched the corners of her mouth. Yes. The chamber watched them carefully now, no longer listening to a diplomatic exchange so much as observing two strategists testing each other in real time. Sir Keith's gaze lowered briefly toward the dark glasses covering Russell's eyes. I expected, she said softly, that human cybernetic medicine would have restored your vision by now. The room shifted slightly at the statement, not because of cruelty, because everyone present understood exactly what she was referencing without her needing to say it directly. Varakun's interrogation chambers, the retinal implants, the torture. Russell answered with the same calm he had used throughout the meeting. The damage extended beyond the implants themselves. He lifted one hand briefly toward the glasses before letting it rest again against the chair arm. The orbital trauma destroyed too much of the visual nerve structure. Replacement systems were attempted, none of them worked. No self-pity, no anger, just fact. The blindness is permanent. A quieter stillness settled over the chamber after that. Sir regarded him for a moment longer. And the glasses, Russell gave the faintest shrug. Protection mostly. Slight pause. The remaining damage underneath tends to make people uncomfortable. Several species in the chamber shifted subtly at the dry understatement. For the first time since entering the chamber, Sir Keith's expression changed in a way small enough that only someone studying her carefully would have noticed. Not pity, something closer to recognition. Then Russell spoke again. You studied human customs carefully enough to identify marriage as political unification. His tone remained even. You should also understand that humans generally expect courtship before proposals. I was informed humans appreciated directness, she said. Is that a refusal? No, Russell said calmly. That's caution. Something close to genuine interest crossed Sira's expression. Caution is rational, she said, particularly between civilizations that have already survived one another. The chamber remained completely silent. Around them now, earlier tension had carried confusion and shock. This silence felt different, focused. They were watching a conversation that no longer sounded entirely diplomatic and not entirely personal either. Sira Keth turned slightly, addressing the wider council again without fully removing her attention from Russell. I am not requesting immediate acceptance, she said. The Vorath Dominion is prepared to begin formal negotiations regarding intergalactic alliance, military stabilization agreements, trade integration, and shared technological development between our governments. Several delegates shifted visibly at that. The Vior representatives began exchanging rapid Lovist calculations through their implants. Almost immediately, one of the smaller outer rim species leaned toward another delegate with poorly concealed urgency. After the words technological development reached the translator systems, Tark Sovin watched all of it with growing irritation. You speak about alliance, he said, sharply while your fleet sits armed. Above this station. Siraith looked toward him, her voice soothing. Would your government have trusted me enough to arrive undefended? Tarkovan opened his mouth. Nothing came out immediately, not because he lacked an answer, because the obvious answer weakened his own position, no matter how he framed it. Sirakith continued before. The silence became hostile. The harvester of silence remains outside direct tactical engagement range. My escort fleet has complied with every orbital restriction established by SFJ. Prime Command Authority. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Saras. Your military officers have already confirmed this. Saras didn't like being used as validation for her argument. That does not make me comfortable, he said. No. Siraith replied, it makes you disciplined. A faint murmur passed through parts of the chamber again. Russell listened to the room carefully. The pheromonal profile had shifted once more during the exchange, not stronger, more selective. Siraith adjusted it almost conversationally, easing tension after confrontation, reinforcing calm whenever discussion risked hardening into outright hostility. The Sarathi elder folded his hands slowly before speaking. 5 years ago, this chamber feared destruction, he said quietly. Now it is being asked to consider union with the civilization that nearly caused it. His calm gaze moved across the delegates gathered around him. Perhaps the more dangerous question is whether war has truly ended or merely changed shape. Nobody answered him immediately, because nobody in the room was entirely certain. Sirakith inclined her head slightly toward the elder in acknowledgement. A reasonable concern, she said. Tark. Sova made a low sound that suggested he considered the entire conversation one extended strategic mistake. Russell finally rose from the high counselor's chair. The movement drew the chamber's attention back toward him. Immediately, he stood with the same controlled stillness that had carried him through war councils, invasion, alerts, and the collapse of governments. Blindness had changed many things about him over the last 5 years. Authority was not one of them. The council will review the proposal, he said calmly. Until that review is complete, the Vorath delegation will remain restricted to authorized diplomatic sectors under Solve Prime Security Protocol. Formal words, careful words, but nobody missed the fact that he had still not refused her. Sir studied him for a moment longer as the chamber systems began quietly signaling procedural adjournment across the outer displays. You adapted well, Lord War, she said softly, her gaze lowered briefly toward the dark glasses. Better than most species would have. Russell's expression did not change. We didn't have much choice, he replied. For the first time since arriving at Solfik Prime, Sierra Keith smiled. Openly, small, controlled, but unmistakably real. Then she turned and walked away from the chamber alone, while the Galactic Council watched in complete silence. The council chamber did not empty immediately after Siraith's departure. Clusters formed. Instead, delegates who had spent years sitting beside one another now spoke in lowered voices behind partially shielded translation fields, while tactical projections continued rotating silently. Above the chamber floor, some species argued openly for caution. Others had already moved beyond caution into calculation. The Vor representatives wanted access to Vorath Energy Systems. Several outer rim governments viewed Intergalactic Alliance as the only realistic protection against future threats beyond a realist space. Others trusted nothing about the proposal at all. Tark Sovan had nearly started a second diplomatic incident before leaving the chamber and was currently demanding expanded fleet mobilization across 3 Keld sectors. Whether the Council approved it or not, the fracture lines had appeared faster than anyone wanted to admit. That was the part Russell understood immediately. Sarah Keith had not needed the Council to accept her proposal. She only needed them discussing it. The debate itself was the weapon. For 5 years the Aurelius Galaxy had remained unified, largely because survival left little room for ideological division. Now she had introduced possibility back into the equation: prosperity, security, technological advancement, stability, without endless military expansion. And the moment some species began imagining that future while others feared it, the Council stopped thinking with one mind. The internal bleeding had already started. Less than 24 hours after Sarah Keith left Sulphage Prime, an incident occurred above Athari Station that shifted the political balance across the Council. Almost immediately, the transport platform above the station exploded during peak civilian transfer rotation when concealed charges detonated across 2 docking spines. Simultaneously, the initial blast tore through 2 docking spines and sent burning debris across the station's lower habitation ring before emergency bulkheads sealed automatically. By the time local security regained control of internal systems, more than 11,000 civilians were trapped inside collapsing transit sectors with atmosphere pressure falling faster than rescue crews could stabilize it. The first emergency transmissions reached SFG Prime 12 minutes later. The second arrived 30 seconds after that. Vorath fleet signatures exiting faster than light transit directly above orbit. Panic spread through portions of the Council network almost immediately. Several systems initially believed that Dominion had launched a coordinated strike without warning. Emergency defense channels overloaded so badly that local command authorities temporarily lost targeting synchronization across half the station grid. Then Siraith's fleet moved not toward the station, toward the attackers. The combat feeds reached Solfec Prime in fragmented bursts through damaged relay systems. Unidentified assault craft breaking formation under concentrated Vorath fire, while Dominion interceptors cut through the debris field surrounding Athari Station with machine-level precision. The Harvester of Silence itself never entered firing range. It remained above the engagement, directing fleet coordination while smaller Vorath vessels pushed directly into the unstable wreckage field to extract civilians before atmosphere loss reached catastrophic levels. By the time Aurella's reinforcements arrived, the attackers were gone and Vorath rescue teams were already inside the station. The chamber aboard Solfege Prime watched the aftermath unfold across live tactical feeds and uneasy silence. Burning corridors, evacuation lines, Vorath soldiers carrying injured civilians through decompression sectors, while emergency systems failed around them. Tark Sovan looked openly furious for reasons even he probably understood. Poorly she staged this, he said flatly. Do you have proof? One of the Via delegates asked immediately. No. Then what exactly are you accusing her of? Tarkovin looked ready to answer that question with violence instead of language before deciding against it. Russell remained silent near the central display while casualty numbers continued updating across the lower tactical feeds. Beside him, Ciros monitored the incoming combat footage and tactical reports, quietly describing the situation as it unfolded across Athari Station. The attackers used modified council transit signatures, he said, quietly, enough that only Russell and Akefer heard clearly. Clean insertion. Professional timing. You think they were real? Akefer asked. I think Cirrus replied that whoever organized this understood exactly how the aftermath would look. Across the chamber, the political shift had already begun. Some species that had entered the previous meeting, uncertain, now possessed fresh visual evidence of Vorath ships protecting Orlist civilians, while the council itself struggled to coordinate a response quickly enough to matter. Serketh had arrived, offering stability. Less than a day later, instability appeared precisely where she could be seen, stopping it. One of the Outer Rim delegates finally turned toward him. Lord War, the representative said carefully, if the Dominion truly intends cooperation, refusing negotiations may eventually become harder to justify. Several others did not disagree. Later, the command room had emptied except for the three of them. Beyond the observation glass, Solve Prime drifted beneath scattered traffic patterns, while the Harvester of Silence remained suspended in distant orbit like a second artificial moon, watching the station. Patiently, Severus stood near the tactical display, with a data slate in one hand while Offer leaned against the edge of the operations table reviewing deployment requests from Ghost Unit's internal network. Russell remained near the glass, listening. The station carried a different sound now than it had 48 hours earlier. More security movement through the diplomatic sectors, more ships repositioning around orbital checkpoints, more controlled urgency buried beneath official calm. Severus looked up from the slate. Eventually, so he said with quiet amusement, are you going to become a married man? Akeper almost laughed despite himself. Russell's expression remained perfectly neutral beneath the dark glasses. At my age, he replied, that sounds exhausting. Sayes shook his head once. The entire Orelus galaxy nearly stopped breathing. And that's your answer? I lost the energy for dramatic relationships. Sometime around my third war, that got an actual laugh out of Akefer, even. Severus looked briefly satisfied with himself before the humor faded naturally. Back out of the room, Russell turned away from the glass. She already knows the answer, he said calmly. Neither Cirrus nor Akefer disagreed. She didn't come here expecting acceptance, Russell continued. She came here to establish political division. Before the refusal happened, Akefer folded his arms, and after the refusal, Russell's voice remained steady. She escalates. The simplicity of the statement settled heavily into the room. Severus placed the data slate onto the tactical table. I'm ready. Russell tilted his head slightly toward him. Severe activated. The display, several transit routes, appeared across the projection field, immediately highlighted alongside cargo manifests, intercepted communication logs, and partially reconstructed financial movement patterns stretching across multiple council systems. We started tracing the modified signatures used during the Athari attack, Severus said. The network doesn't originate inside the Dominion. HFY studied the projections. Orally space, Severus nodded once. Smuggling routes, black market military exchanges, quiet infrastructure. Placement spread across multiple systems over the last 3 years. His jaw tightened slightly. Somebody's been moving Voreth compatible weapons and neural hardware into council territory long before Siraith arrived. Russell remained very still while Severus continued. She prepared for both outcomes, Severus said, alliance or war. HFY looked back toward Russell. She already had operational assets inside the galaxy before she made the proposal. Yes, Russell said quietly. Not surprised, that part unsettled HFY more than the discovery itself. Cirrus zoomed the tactical projection outward until dozens of highlighted sectors spread across the Aurelus galaxy. We can contain some of it, he said. Not all of it, not quickly. Russell listened to the faint hum of the tactical systems for a moment before answering. Then don't prepare for containment. Cyrus looked at him carefully. Russell's expression never changed. Prepare for impact. The communication request arrived 3 hours later. Private channel Voreth encryption directly addressed to Lord War. HFY looked toward Russell from across the command office as the notification pulsed softly against the wall display. She wastes no time, he muttered. Russell remained seated behind the low tactical desk near the observation glass, one hand resting lightly against the arm of the chair. Put her through. Holographic field activated slowly this time instead of appearing all at once. Light gathered across the center of the room before resolving into the image of Sireth standing somewhere aboard the harvester of silence, not a command bridge, something quieter. The lighting around her was softer than the harsh operational illumination used throughout most Voreth military structures, reflecting faintly across dark metallic surfaces built into the walls behind her. She had changed attire since the council session. The ceremonial black layers were gone, replaced by a fitted, dark silver garment traced with faint, luminous lines beneath the fabric. Its design followed Voreth aesthetics rather than human ones, severe in some places, fluid in others, conveying authority without openly displaying it. The tiara-like neural crown woven through her pale hair had changed as well. Not larger, more intricate, thin arcs of black alloy curved backward from her temples before disappearing beneath silver-white strands arranged with the same controlled elegance that shaped everything else about her presentation. HFY stared for half a second longer than he intended to. Sir Keith noticed immediately, then her attention settled fully on Russell. You requested privacy, she said softly. Russell inclined his head slightly. I requested honesty. Something faintly amused touched her expression, a dangerous distinction. The room quieted around the holographic projection outside the observation glass. Solve Prime's orbital traffic drifted silently beneath the station lights, while somewhere beyond them the harvester of silence waited in darkness. Russell folded his hands lightly together. You already know my answer. Sireth did not deny it. Yes, no manipulation in the word, no disappointment either, just recognition. Russell's voice remained calm. You came here offering stability through Integration, shared command structures. Shared military authority, shared. Political control, a slight pause, you. Call it alliance because that sounds better than absorption. Akepper saw the smallest shift in Kraith's posture, then interest again. Not offense, you believe independence matters more than survival, she said. I believe civilization stopped belonging to themselves once dependence becomes permanent. The silence after that lasted several seconds when Sarah Keith finally answered. Her voice had softened slightly. Your species would have flourished beside mine. Russell gave the faintest shake of his head. Beside you eventually. Becomes beneath you, maybe not immediately, maybe not intentionally. But power centralizes. It always does. Siraith studied him quietly through the projection field, and if I told you I would have shared it willingly. Russell's expression never changed. I'd believe you. That answer seemed to affect her more than refusal would have, because he meant it. He believed she was sincere and rejected her anyway. Akepper watched the realization settle slowly across her face, not emotional hurt, not anger, but the recognition that Russell understood her clearly, enough to refuse without misunderstanding her intentions at all. For the first time since the connection opened, Siraith looked briefly away from him, only for a second, then she returned her attention to the blind old man seated across two galaxies of history. That is unfortunate, she said quietly. Russell leaned back slightly in the chair. Yes, he agreed, I think it is. 10 hours after Russell refused her proposal, the planet disappeared. Not metaphorically. Physically. The first warning reached Solf Prime through deep-range observatories positioned near the outer edge of the Aurelis corridor. At first the readings looked like sensor corruption, gravitational distortions forming briefly around the Kelt colony world of Vashar before collapsing faster than local monitoring systems could classify them. Then the planetary shield network failed all at once, every layer simultaneously. The emergency feed opened across the council chamber. Seconds later, Russell arrived alongside Severus and Akepper, just as the tactical projection stabilized into visual coherence above the central floor. Vishar rotated silently beneath scattered cloud cover while orbital defense platforms attempted to reposition around it in visible confusion. Civilian traffic flooded every available departure vector, hundreds of ships trying to leave orbit simultaneously. Then space opened above the planet. No fleet emerged, no visible weapon fired. The distortion simply unfolded across low orbit like reality tearing along invisible seams. Several delegates in the chamber recoiled instinctively as the feed struggled to maintain image stability. Severus stared at the tactical readings. What is that? Nobody answered him. Distortion expanded downward toward the atmosphere in absolute silence. Then the planet broke. Continents separated first beneath impossible gravitational stress, while oceans lifted upward into the widening fracture running through the planetary core itself. Entire population centers vanished beneath collapsing tectonic shock waves. Before the atmosphere ignited around them, emergency transmissions flooded the chamber speakers all at once. Civilian frequencies, military channels, distress calls overlapping so heavily the translation system stopped separating voices correctly. Billions of beings trying to survive the end of their world simultaneously. The fracture reached the core 31 seconds. After first contact, VAR came apart in orbit, the remains spread outward in burning planetary debris, while the tactical feed dissolved into static from radiation saturation. Nobody in the chamber moved. Tark Sovan stood completely motionless near the forward display, staring at the remains of the Celt colony world without blinking. The scaled structure along his jaw had gone rigid enough to look carved from stone. Savora spoke first. Fleet Origin, the tactical officer at the lower station, looked pale. There wasn't one. What? No fleet emergence, no visible firing platform. The weapon signature originated from outside standard engagement range. The officer swallowed once. Much farther outside. Russell understood immediately. Sir Kith had withdrawn her fleet after Ari deliberately not restrained positioning. She wanted the Council to understand that distance no longer protected them. The chamber alarms began sounding before anyone spoke again. Incoming transmission, Vorith. Encryption priority override. The central display activated automatically. Sir appeared standing within the holographic field. The same controlled composure still surrounding her, despite the burning remains of a dead planet rotating silently across the tactical projections behind the Council chamber. No triumph showed on her face. That somehow made it worse. I offered peace, she said calmly. Chamber remained frozen around her. I offered alliance, stability, and the end of future conflict between our civilizations. Her gaze settled toward Russell. I was willing to build something permanent. Tark Sovan moved first. You murdered billions. Sir Keith looked toward him. Briefly, yes, no hesitation, no defense. Just fact. Then her attention returned to Russell. But your galaxy still mistakes restraint for weakness. Her voice remained low and perfectly controlled. I spent years believing coexistence with humanity would be possible. A slight pause. I have since learned that only war obtains what cannot be surrendered willingly. The chamber seemed to constrict around the words, not because anyone still doubted what she meant, because she was saying it openly now. No diplomacy left. No negotiation. No political ambiguity. War. Sir Keith regarded Russell quietly through the holographic field for one final second, then she spoke the last words almost softly. Prepare your fleets, Lord War. The transmission ended. Silence hit the chamber harder than the alarms had. War spread across the Aurelus galaxy before the debris of Vashar finished cooling. The first engagements began less than 3 hours after Surikith's transmission ended. Vorith strike groups emerged along major transit corridors, simultaneously targeting military relay stations, logistics hubs, and shield generator arrays with a kind of precision that only existed when preparation had started long before the shooting did. This time the Aureli's fleets were waiting for them. Humanity had spent 5 years studying Vorith warfare without pretending the next conflict would resemble the last one. Fleet formations changed constantly now, avoiding the rigid coordination patterns the Dominion preferred to exploit. Human and Celt carrier groups operated inside rotating shield layers built from combined Council technology, while Arconian sensor vessels flooded combat zones with interference fields specifically designed to fracture neural Synchronization between Vorath ships. The first Dominion assaulted the Kelt. Frontier failed in 11 minutes. The second destroyed 2 Council fleets. Anyway, the war became that kind of mathematics almost immediately. Victory no longer meant surviving. Intact, it meant surviving slightly longer than the other side. Severus commanded from orbital command, above Sulfega Prime with the same cold precision that had carried humanity through the previous war, though the scale now dwarfed anything the Aurelus galaxy had faced before. Entire sectors moved across the tactical displays beneath his hands, while casualty projections updated faster than exhausted tactical officers could fully process them. Shift 3rd Fleet 6 degrees. Starboard, he ordered without raising his voice. If the Dominion center commits there, collapse the corridor behind them and burn the transit lane. A younger officer nodded and transmitted the order across the projection field. Hundreds of ships died over the next 4 minutes. The Dominion losses were heavier. The line held. Humanity's new weapons changed the war in ways the Vorath had not fully anticipated. Iraq Gore alloy plating spread visual distortion across battlefield ranges, turning human strike formations into overlapping phantom signatures that forced Dominion targeting systems to split fire across false vectors. Neural feedback mines detonated directly against Vorath synchronization frequencies, overloading linked command structures hard enough to leave entire Dominion squadrons suddenly fighting as disconnected individuals. And the ghost units made the fear worse. Not just one unit anymore, 7 men. Blind combat teams deployed across boarding actions throughout the war, moving through darkened ships without visual systems, while Vorath troops discovered too late that human soldiers no longer relied on the senses. Dominion interference knew how to corrupt. Stories spread quickly after that. Marines fighting through smoke-filled corridors where targeting systems failed. Vorath command nodes going dark moments before human boarding teams appeared inside sealed sectors. Ships captured from the inside by soldiers moving through darkness as though they belonged there. The Dominion adapted. By the 6th day of the war, gravitational strikes against civilian worlds were forcing human fleets to split their defenses across multiple fronts at once. 3 Council planets burned during coordinated orbital attacks, while Dominion assault groups pressed deeper into a realist space faster than reinforcement fleets could stabilize the collapsing lines. Civilian casualties climbed into the billions again as military command structures were forced into impossible decisions: defend the population centers or hold the warfront. The harvester of silence moved continuously between combat zones without fully committing to any single engagement, directing fleet coordination while staying beyond every serious assassination attempt launched against it. Then Russell changed the strategy. The command room aboard Orbital Command had gone nearly silent from exhaustion. By the time he entered, Severus looked up from the tactical display. Immediately. No, Russell stopped beside the projection table. You don't even know what I was going to say. I know you. Okay. 4 remained near the chamber entrance, with the other 6 members of Ghost Unit standing behind him in full combat. Armor, no helmets, no visual rigs. Training had become doctrine. Cyrus looked from them back to Russell. You're thinking about boarding the single most defended ship in the Dominion. I'm thinking of ending the War, Severos stared at him for several seconds outside the command glass. Damaged Aurelus fleet groups drifted through emergency repair formations above SFA Prime while fresh casualty reports continued scrolling silently across the lower tactical displays. "She'll expect you," Sav said finally. "Yes, and if this is exactly what she wants," Russell's expression never changed, "then she's getting exactly what she asked for." That answer bothered Cyrus, because it sounded exactly like the kind of calculation Saketh herself would make. Akafor stepped forward slightly. "Ghost Unit 1 can get inside," he said. "The new distortion plating masks approach vectors too well for standard Dominion scans to track cleanly." Severus looked at him. "You're talking about boarding the Harvester of Silence during an active fleet engagement?" "Yes, casualty projections." Alkeper was quiet for half a second. "Hi." Russell rested one hand lightly against the edge of the tactical table. "She built this war around centralized control," he said calmly. "The Dominion still depends on her to hold operational cohesion together. Remove Surakith and the fleet structure fractures." Cyrus already knew that. That's why he hated the plan so much. Russell turned slightly toward him. "You handle the fleets," he said quietly. "I'll handle." "Sorry." For a long moment, Cyrus said nothing at all. Then he looked toward the tactical projections spreading across the Aurelus galaxy and understood exactly how many more worlds would die if they failed to end this quickly. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than it had 7 days earlier. "You'd better kill her then." The assault began 9 hours later inside the largest fleet engagement of the war. Severus built the battle around distraction on a scale measured in burning capital ships. 3 Aurelus fleets emerged simultaneously along the outer edge of the Carthan expanse while Dominion forces repositioned to intercept them across overlapping gravitational corridors already destabilized by 6 straight days of continuous combat. Human carriers pushed directly into the center of the engagement instead of maintaining standard defensive spacing, releasing entire waves of distortion-bladed strike craft that fractured into dozens of false signatures across Dominion tactical systems. The Harvester of Silence moved to coordinate the response almost immediately, exactly where Cyrus wanted it. "Collapse the center corridor now," he ordered. Across the tactical display, Kelp battle groups drove forward into impossible firing angles while Arconian sensor ships detonated synchronized interference bursts directly through the Dominion command lattice. The battlefield dissolved into overlapping signal ghosts and shattered targeting coherence. Then the human dreadnought Helltorm broke apart under concentrated gravitational fire. The explosion tore through the center engagement zone hard enough to blind half the battlefield sensors surrounding it. Inside that expanding debris field, a ship no larger than a transport shuttle disappeared completely. Ghost Unit crossed the remaining distance to the Harvester of Silence under total electronic blackout. No running lights, no active scans, no communications, only inertial drift through burning wreckage while the war consumed itself. Around them, Akafor sat opposite Russell inside the dark troop compartment while the other 6 Marines remained locked into restraint frames along the bulkhead walls. Nobody spoke much anymore, not because of fear, because they had already spent the last 7 hours saying the things that mattered: weapons checks, finished silently, combat blades, secured maglock harnesses, armed, pulse, rifles calibrated for close quarters, breech work. Russell sat perfectly still beneath the dim red emergency lighting with the dark glasses reflecting almost nothing back at the compartment around him. The shuttle rocked once as nearby weapons fire rolled through the debris field. Outside, then the pilot's voice came quietly through the compartment. Speakers approaching whole range, the harvester of silence filled the forward sensor display. A few seconds later, even this close, the flagship looked less like a constructed vessel and more like something carved from black stone, drifting through space. Its dark surfaces extended beyond the limits of the viewing frame, while faint gravitational distortions moved across sections of the hull where Dominion shielding bent light unnaturally around it. Boarding vector locked, the pilot said. A pause. Good luck. The shuttle struck the flagship without warning. The magnetic clamps engaged instantly against the outer hull plating while emergency breach charges detonated through the docking seal. A heartbeat later, the compartment door split open into smoke and flashing emergency light. Ghost unit moved immediately, fast, precise. The first 2 Marines entered low and silent through the burning breach, while HFY followed beside Russell into the interior corridor beyond. Dominion alarms were already sounding deeper inside the ship, harsh mechanical pulses echoing through the metallic structure around them. Russell tilted his head slightly. 3 ahead, he said quietly. HFY heard them. Half a second later, Voreth soldiers emerged through the smoke at the far end of the corridor with phase weapons already rising toward the breach point. Ghost unit opened fire first. The confined corridor exploded into close-range violence instantly. Pulse rounds hammered through black armor, while Dominion returned fire tore glowing lines through the smoke-filled air. 1 Marine went down almost immediately, thrown backward against the corridor wall hard enough to crack armor plating. Beneath the impact, the others kept moving. A Voreth soldier charged through the gunfire with a neural whip snapping forward toward Russell's throat. Russell turned before the strike fully extended. The whip cracked through empty air where his neck had been a fraction earlier. He caught the weapon arm against his shoulder, stepped inside the Voreth's reach, and drove a combat knife upward beneath the jaw, plating hard enough to sever the neural spine. Interface beneath it, the soldier collapsed without a sound. Left corridor, HFY shouted. More Voreth troops were converging already. The harvester of silence was responding faster than any previous boarding target they had faced. Bulkhead sections were sealing dynamically throughout the ship, while synchronized troop movements repositioned toward the breach sectors with machine-level efficiency. She knows we're here, 1 Marine said. Through comms, Russell listened to the movement patterns echoing through the ship around them. No, he said calmly. She knows I'm here. That changed the silence afterward. Ghost unit pushed deeper into the flagship while the war outside continued tearing entire fleets apart beyond the hull around them. Emergency lighting strobed red across the corridors while Dominion security formations collapsed inward toward the central command sectors, exactly where Russell expected them to. The deeper they moved, the heavier the resistance became. 2 more Marines died before they reached the inner transit spine. One disappeared beneath concentrated phase fired during a corridor crossing. That lasted less than 4 seconds. Another stayed behind, manually sealing a blast door long enough for the others to escape, a containment lockdown designed to vent the entire sector into open space. The team kept moving because stopping would have killed the rest of them too. The name stayed with them. Anyway, Russell led the final approach himself. By sound, by airflow, by the faint chemical traces drifting through the flagship's ventilation systems beneath. The smell of smoke and weapons discharge. Sarah Keith's pheromonal profile remained everywhere. Russell recognized the pattern immediately. It meant she was somewhere ahead of them, waiting. The command chamber at the center of the harvester of silence looked nothing like the brutal military interiors Ghost Unit had fought through. To reach it, the room was quiet, dark. Metallic walls curved upward into a vaulted structure lined with flowing streams of pale data light moving beneath the surface like slow currents. Beneath black water, tactical projections rotated silently across the far end of the chamber, while the distant vibrations of fleet combat pulsed faintly through the deck beneath their boots. Sarah Keith stood alone at the center platform, waiting for them. No guards, no visible weapons, only the same impossible composure she had carried into the council chamber at Solfge Prime. The surviving members of Ghost Unit spread instinctively through the room, rifles tracking every angle automatically, while Offer moved to Russell's side. Sarah Keith's gaze settled on him immediately. "You came," she said softly. Russell removed the combat knife from his belt. "You expected me to." A faint expression crossed her face. "Yes." Around them, the ship continued, trembling under distant weapons impacts as the battle outside intensified. Somewhere far beyond the chamber walls, Saris was burning fleets apart to keep this opportunity alive long enough for them to finish it. Sirath looked briefly toward the surviving members of Ghost Unit. "Your Marines are loyal. You studied us closely," Russell replied. Something about that answer seemed to please her. Then her attention returned fully to him. "You understand. This changes nothing if you fail here," she said quietly. "The Dominion will continue. Maybe. And if you kill me, another war eventually replaces this one." Russell's expression never changed. "Probably." The honesty of the answer lingered between them for a second. Then Russell spoke without turning his head. "Akepper, sir, if this goes wrong, you get the others out." Akepper's jaw tightened. "Immediately, Lord War, that's an order." His voice remained calm. "Do not intervene unless you need to protect yourselves. Not me." Akepper looked like he wanted to argue, but the words never came. Understanding settled across his expression slowly. Instead, this had never truly been about fleets or politics or even the war itself. It had always been about the two people standing at the center of it. Sirith moved first, fast enough that even Ghost Unit tracked it a fraction too late. A phase blade unfolded from beneath her sleeve in a burst of pale energy as she crossed the distance between them. Almost instantly, Russell turned into the attack instead of away from it, catching the first strike against the reinforced guard of his combat knife, while the impact sent a violent shock through his arm, hard enough to stagger him sideways. The room exploded into motion. Sir fought nothing like the Vorith Soldier's ghost unit had spent years learning to kill, no wasted aggression, no mechanical brutality. Every movement flowed into the next with terrifying precision, forcing Russell backward across the chamber under a storm of strikes designed less to overpower him than to dismantle him. Piece by piece, Russell adapted immediately, not by matching her speed, by refusing the rhythm she expected. He fought at close range while the chamber filled with the sharp metallic crack of blade impacts. Twice Siraith came close enough for him to smell the controlled pheromonal output beneath the heat of combat. Even now, she was regulating herself. Even now, she was managing the room. Russell drove forward suddenly, abandoning defense long enough to force her backward for the first time since the fight began. His knife caught across her side, slicing through part of the dark silver armor beneath her ribs. Sira Keith struck him through the abdomen, and instant later, HFY took a step forward automatically. Stay back, Russell snapped. The command stopped him cold. Russell staggered but remained standing, blood already spreading beneath the damaged combat armor, while Sira watched him carefully from several meters away. For the first time since the fight started, her breathing had changed slightly. Not fear, effort. "You're dying," she said quietly. Russell wiped blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of one hand. "At my age," he answered hoarsely. "That was always the plan." Eventually, something sharp and unreadable crossed her expression, then almost anger, almost admiration. Then she attacked again. The final exchange happened too fast for anyone else in the chamber to fully follow. Cleanly, Russell caught the opening strike against his knife guard and failed to stop the next two cleanly. The third slammed against his forearm armor, hard enough to twist him sideways. Fourth drove straight through his chest. The phase blade punched through him hard, enough to drive him backward onto one. Nay. HFY moved again. Russell stopped him with a single raised hand. Sira Keith stood over him, breathing harder now, pale blue skin marked by blood spreading beneath the damaged silver armor where Russell had cut her. Earlier, the chamber had gone nearly silent except for distant fleet impacts echoing through the hull. "You could have stood beside me," she said softly. Russell looked up toward the sound of her voice through blood loss and pain, already pulling at the edges of consciousness. "No," he whispered, "you wanted us beneath you." For a moment, neither of them moved. Sira Keith looked genuinely tired, not physically, something deeper than that. Then she deactivated the phase blade. The energy edge vanished with a low, harmonic hiss. She turned away from him. Not in mercy, not in contempt, simply finished. HFY raised his rifle. Instinctively, Russell was dying. Ghost unit was trapped deep inside a collapsing flagship. Outside the chamber, the Dominion fleet still outnumbered Orless forces badly enough that victory remained uncertain even now. Sir Keith ignored him completely. She took 3 steps toward the chamber exit, then Russell moved behind her fast enough that pain and blood loss seemed irrelevant for a single impossible second. HFY saw Siraith realize what he was doing a fraction too late. Russell drove the combat knife upward into the base of her neck beneath the neural crown assembly with enough force to bury the blade to the handle. Sira Keith stopped moving instantly. The chamber went still. Russell remained standing behind her for 2 more seconds, while blood spread across both of them. Beneath the pale command lighting, then, Sakth collapsed, pulling Lord War down. With her, he hit the floor hard enough that HFY crossed the chamber before the sound finished echoing. Lord War. Siraketh was dead. The pale blue of her skin had already begun losing warmth. Beneath the fractured black arcs of the neural crown, the realization seemed to move through the ship itself, beyond the chamber walls. Dominion coordination. Signals collapsed into chaos. Emergency transmissions flooded, overlapping channels as fleet formations lost synchronization across multiple sectors. Simultaneously, somewhere outside, Cirrus was already watching it happen across the battlefield. The center had broken. HFY dropped beside Russell. Blood ran steadily from the wound through his chest, spreading dark across the shattered remains of his combat armor, while distant impacts rolled through the harvester of silence beneath them. Medical evac is 2 minutes out, he said. Russell almost smiled at the lie. The surviving members of Ghost Unit moved automatically, weapons still raised, while smoke drifted through the chamber. Around them, one Marine sealed the entrance while another checked the tactical displays for incoming security. Responses. None came. The harvester of silence was dying around them. HFY leaned closer. Russell's voice sounded weaker now, roughened by blood, filling his lungs beneath every word. Listen carefully. Around them, Ghost Units stood in silence while alarms pulsed through the chamber in distant mechanical waves. Russell turned his head slightly toward them. You did well. Simple words, Marine. Words somehow heavier than speeches would have been. Karen lowered his head. Immediately, Scott looked away toward the burning tactical displays along the far wall. Russell's breathing caught once before continuing. Ghost Unit survives, he said quietly. That matters. HFY's jaw tightened. We're getting you out. Russell ignored it. You'll take the council seat after me. HFY looked genuinely shaken for the first time since entering the flagship. No, that wasn't a request. The authority still existed beneath the failing body, calm, certain, impossible to argue with even now. Russell coughed, suddenly, blood staining the corner of his mouth beneath the dark glasses. Somewhere below them, something massive exploded through the flagship structure. The deck shook once beneath their feet. The harvester of silence was coming apart. Russell's voice dropped lower. Savarus will pretend he doesn't help. A faint breath that almost became a laugh. Don't let him win that argument. The strength had begun leaving him visibly now, tension fading from his shoulders while blood loss pulled him steadily away from the chamber around him. His final words came quietly, almost conversationally. Tell them. A shallow breath. Tell them peace was worth the trouble. The breath after that never came. HFY remained kneeling beside him while the chamber alarms continued sounding through the dying flagship around them. Lord War did not move again. The death of Siraith shattered the Dominion command structure within minutes. Some Vorith fleets fought on, briefly out of training and momentum, before realizing the synchronization network holding their formations together had collapsed completely. Others attempted retreat immediately. Several surrendered for the first time in recorded Dominion military history. Once Aurelus forces began systematically surrounding isolated sectors cut off from central coordination. Cirrus did not waste the opportunity. The war ended over the next 5 days. Through relentless pursuit operations. Across the remaining combat corridors of Ailey space, Dominion shipyards were seized intact where possible, weapons, platforms captured, neural link systems dismantled and transported under maximum security protocols toward research facilities already preparing to study technology humanity had once considered centuries beyond reach. Some Dominion vessels chose self-destruction rather than surrender. Enough survived anyway. By the end of the campaign, the Aurelus Galaxy possessed more Vorith technology than the Dominion had lost in every previous war combined. The cost sat in the trillions, worlds burned, fleets erased, entire species permanently reduced, but the galaxy remained free. Russell's funeral was held beneath the reconstructed Council Dome on Solfet Prime 10 days later. The chamber looked different now than it had during Tharvix's final speech years. Earlier, reinforced structures had replaced sections destroyed during the first Vorith attack, though the architects had deliberately preserved portions of the original crystal walls instead of rebuilding them completely. Representatives from all 34 council species attended, so did military officers, civilians, diplomats, workers from reconstruction sectors, and survivors from worlds Russell had never personally visited but had still helped save through decisions most of them would never fully know. No massive speeches dominated the ceremony. The Sarathi elder spoke briefly about endurance. Tarksovan spoke even more briefly about courage before appearing deeply uncomfortable with the concept of public grief and sitting back down again. Almost immediately afterward, Severus approached the memorial platform. Last, he stood there quietly for several seconds, looking at Lord War's dark glasses resting atop the memorial case, beside the folded combat armor recovered from the Harvester of Silence. "I told you to kill her," he said. Pause. "Forgot to tell you to come back alive." Sira stepped away from the platform without another word. Akafur stood at the front of the honor escort now, one shoulder beneath the weight of the memorial coffin alongside the remaining members of Ghost Unit 1. The entire council rose together as the escort began carrying Russell from the chamber beneath the same high ceiling where Lord Peace had once died, trying to preserve peace. 34 species standing in silence for the man who had carried the war for them. Outside, reconstruction ships already moved through the orbital lanes surrounding Solf Prime. Across the Aurelus Galaxy, reconstruction had already begun again. Fleets repositioned, borders stabilized. Species that had once expected extinction returned slowly to the work of surviving. 5 years earlier, Lord Peace had built the future. Lord War made sure it remained theirs. Hey there, space human, I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind, or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing, I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.